Welcome, dear traveler of the twilight hours. Welcome to this long and winding journey through the ancient places where monsters dwell, where shadows breathe, and where the old stories still whisper in the darkness between sleeping and waking. Tonight, we embark together on a 3-hour odyssey through the hidden realms of Greek mythology, through labyrinths and straits, through cursed temples and poisonous swamps, through mountain lairs and prisons deep beneath the earth. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. What corner of our modern world you've chosen as your resting place, while we venture into these ancient territories. Perhaps you're nestled in your bed as rain patters against windows. Or maybe you're settling into the quiet hours of a night shift, or finding refuge from insomnia in these old stories. Wherever you are, know that you're welcome here, in the gentle embrace of boring mythology, where we tell the longest stories in the slowest ways, where urgency has no place, and where the only destination is peaceful sleep. The journey ahead is extensive, unhurried, designed to carry you through the entire arc of a night's rest. We'll move like ancient Greek travelers might have moved, on foot through mythic landscapes, taking our time, noticing everything, rushing toward nothing. There will be no sudden turns, no jarring surprises, only the steady, rhythmic unfolding of stories within stories, places within places, each one leading naturally to the next like chambers in an endless temple, like dreams flowing into dreams. Tonight, we begin in the warm Mediterranean dusk, where the air still holds the day's heat, but the shadows have begun their slow conquest of the land. The olive trees stand silver green against the darkening sky, their leaves whispering secrets older than memory. The cicadas have begun their evening chorus, that ancient sound that has accompanied every Greek story since stories began. Somewhere in the distance, the sea breathes against unseen shores, its rhythm as constant as time itself. And it is here, in this liminal moment between day and night, that we find our first doorway into the realm where monsters dwell. Picture, if you will, the landscape of ancient Greece spreading before us like a map drawn in shadows and starlight. Not the Greece of white marble temples gleaming in the sun, but the Greece of caves and crevices, of deep forests and deeper waters, of mountains that pierce the sky and caverns that pierce the earth. This is the Greece where monsters make their homes, where the normal rules of nature bend and break, where the impossible becomes not just possible, but inevitable. First, there is the island of Crete, floating like a dream in the wine-dark sea, and beneath its palace of Knossos, the great labyrinth spirals down and down into darkness. Can you feel it there? That massive weight of stone and shadow, that architectural madness designed by Daedalus to contain something that should never have existed, something born of divine punishment and human shame? The labyrinth waits, patient as stone, complex as thought, and at its heart, the Minotaur paces his endless prison, neither fully man nor fully bull, but something more terrible than either could be alone. The walls of the labyrinth are smooth limestone, worn by centuries of touch, by the hands of slaves who built it, by the shoulders of the creature who inhabits it, by the desperate fingers of those sent to feed its hunger. The passages turn and return upon themselves, a geometry of confusion where every path seems right until it proves wrong, where the way forward becomes the way back, where up might be down and left might be right. The air within is thick and still, heavy with the scent of stone dust, and something else, something animal and ancient, the musk of the bull-headed prince who walks these corridors in eternal solitude. Then, far to the east, where the sea narrows between Sicily and the Italian mainland, the Strait of Messina holds its own double terror. Here, Scylla and Charybdis maintain their ancient vigil, one on either side of the passage, forcing sailors to choose between disasters. Scylla, once beautiful, now transformed into something that defies description, waits in her cave halfway up the cliff face. 6 heads on serpentine necks, each with triple rows of teeth, extending from a body that has become a prison of flesh and fury. Below, in the depths, Charybdis creates her whirlpool 3 times each day, swallowing the sea itself and everything upon it, then vomiting it back in a cascade of destruction. The water here is never calm, never peaceful. It churns with conflicting currents, with the memory of countless ships splintered between these 2 dooms. The air tastes of salt and fear, and even on the calmest days, sailors can hear the sound that has haunted this strait since the world was young, the howling of Scylla's heads, harmonizing in their hunger, and the great gulping roar of Charybdis as she drinks down the sea. Further inland, in a place where few dare to venture, stands a temple that was once beautiful, once holy, now cursed beyond redemption. This is where Medusa dwells, she who was once a priestess, once possessed of such beauty that it caught the eye of the sea god himself. But beauty in the Greek myths is often a curse disguised as a blessing, and Medusa's transformation from woman to monster happened here, in this very temple where she once served. Now the columns are cracked, the roof partially collapsed, and strange stone figures dot the courtyard, so lifelike you might think they were merely sleeping if you didn't know better. The temple air is different from any other air in Greece. It's thick with the weight of transformation, heavy with the dust of petrification. Snakes move through the shadows here. Ordinary snakes, drawn perhaps by some kinship to their sister serpents that writhe where Medusa's hair once fell in lovely waves. The marble floors, once polished to mirror brightness, are now dull and cracked, stained with substances best left unnamed. And somewhere in the inner sanctum, behind fallen pillars and through doorways that no longer hold doors, Medusa waits with eyes that must never meet another's gaze. Travel south from there to the swamps near the ancient city of Lerna, and you'll find waters that bubble with poisons where the very air can kill. This is the domain of the Hydra, that many-headed serpent whose central head is immortal, whose breath is death, whose blood is venom. The swamp spreads for miles, a labyrinth of waterways and boglands where solid ground is an illusion, and every step might be your last. The trees here grow twisted, their bark blackened, their leaves withered even in the height of summer. No birds nest in these branches, no fish swim in these waters. Only the Hydra moves through this poison paradise, its many heads swaying like deadly flowers on their serpentine stalks. The water of the swamp is dark, almost black, with an oily sheen that reflects no light correctly. It bubbles occasionally, not with heat, but with the exhaled poisons of the creature below. The reeds that grow here are sharp as swords, and they whisper constantly in a wind that seems to come from nowhere and go nowhere. This is a place of multiplication, where cutting one problem creates 2 more, where every solution breeds new challenges, where victory itself might be the greatest defeat. high in the mountains of Lycia, where the peaks scrape the belly of the sky, there is a cave that glows at night with inexplicable fire. This is where the chimera makes her lair, that impossible creature with the head of a lion, the body of a goat, and a serpent for a tail. She is a living contradiction, a biological impossibility that nevertheless exists, breathing fire that burns without fuel, hunting with 3 different instincts combined into one terrible purpose. The mountain itself bears the scars of her presence. Rocks melted and reformed, vegetation burned away in perfect circles, the very stone bearing claw marks that could only come from something that shouldn't exist. The approach to her lair is treacherous, not just from the natural dangers of the mountain, but from the signs of her presence. Bones litter the pathways, bleached white by sun and fire. The air grows thinner as you climb, but also hotter, filled with the sulfur scent of her breath. At night, the mountain glows like a volcano, but this is no geological phenomenon. This is the chimera, breathing her impossible fire into the darkness, a beacon of terror that can be seen for miles. But even the chimera, terrible as she is merely a child compared to her mother. Deep in a cave system that may connect to the very roots of the world, Echidna dwells, she who is called the mother of monsters. Half woman, half serpent, she is the source from which so many of Greece's terrors spring. The chimera is her daughter, as is the Hydra, as is Cerberus, who guards the underworld, as is the Nemean lion, as is the Sphinx. She is fecundity turned monstrous, creation without conscience, the womb of nightmares. Her cave system extends beyond mapping, beyond knowledge. Some say it connects to every cave in Greece, that she can emerge anywhere there is a deep enough shadow. The walls of her domain drip with moisture that might be water or might be something else, something more vital and more terrible. Strange phosphorescent fungi provide the only light, casting everything in shades of green and blue that make even familiar shapes seem alien. The air here is thick with life, but not life as we understand it, life that exists outside the normal rules, life that should not be. And finally, beneath Mount Etna in Sicily, in a prison made by Zeus himself, lies Typhon, father to Echidna's children, the most terrible monster ever to challenge the gods. He is so vast that his head brushes the stars when he stands, so powerful that all the gods fled when he first appeared. Now he lies imprisoned beneath the mountain, and his struggles to escape cause the volcano to erupt. His 100 dragon heads still roar beneath the earth. His wings still beat against his stone prison. His fury still burns as hot as the lava that sometimes breaks free. The mountain above him is never quiet, never still. It rumbles with his breathing, shakes with his struggles, erupts with his rage. The local people have learned to read these signs, to know when Typhon is merely restless and when he is truly fighting against his bonds. They leave offerings at shrines, not to Typhon, but to Zeus, begging the king of gods to keep the chains strong, to keep the prison intact, to keep the monster buried. For if Typhon ever escapes, if he ever breaks free from his imprisonment, the world itself might end in fire and darkness. These, then, are the dwelling places we will explore tonight, these chambers of monstrosity, these geographical impossibilities where the normal rules don't apply. Each location is both a physical place and a psychological space, both a real coordinate on the map of ancient Greece and a symbolic representation of fears that are older than Greece, older than naming, as old as the first time a human looked into the darkness and wondered what looked back. As we journey deeper into the night, we'll visit each of these places in turn, spending time in their terrible company, learning their stories not as quick tales to thrill and frighten, but as slow meditations on the nature of monstrosity itself. We'll walk the labyrinth's passages, feeling our way through stone corridors that mirror the convolutions of the mind. We'll navigate the strait between Scylla and Charybdis, understanding that some choices offer no good options, only degrees of disaster. We'll stand in Medusa's cursed temple and contemplate transformation, both voluntary and involuntary. We'll breathe the poisoned air of the Hydra's swamp and consider how problems multiply when we attack them carelessly. We'll climb to the Chimera's mountain lair and ponder the nature of impossible combinations. We'll descend to Echidna's caves and face the source of monsters. And we'll feel the earth shake with Typhon's rage and understand that some prisons are necessary. But these visits will not be hurried tourist stops, brief pauses to snap a mental photograph before moving on. No, we will settle into each location like ancient travelers who measured journeys in months rather than hours, who knew that the journey itself was more important than the destination. We will let each place reveal itself slowly, like a flower opening to the moon, like a dream that deepens as you fall further into sleep. The night is long and we have time, all the time in the world, to explore these shadows, to understand these monsters not as simple villains, but as complex embodiments of primal forces, as necessary darknesses that define the light. They are not merely creatures to be slain by heroes, though heroes will appear in our stories. They are fundamental aspects of the cosmos, as essential as the gods themselves, perhaps more essential. For what would the gods be without monsters to define their divinity? So settle now into your chosen resting place. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let the concerns of the modern world fade like morning mist. We are entering the ancient world now, the world of stone and shadow, of impossible creatures in impossible places, of stories that spiral like labyrinths toward truth that can only be approached, never quite reached. The journey begins here, in this moment of transition, this threshold between waking and sleeping, between the rational and the mythological, between the possible and the impossible. Listen, can you hear it? Beneath the familiar sounds of your modern night, beneath the hum of electricity and the distant sound of traffic, beneath even the beating of your own heart, there is another sound, older and deeper. It's the sound of stone grinding against stone, of ancient doors opening, of passages that have been sealed for millennia creaking wide to admit us. The labyrinth is opening. The journey into monstrosity begins. The stone is cool beneath your fingers, smooth limestone worn by centuries of touch. And as you trace your hand along the wall, you can feel the subtle curve of the passage, always turning, always leading deeper. This is how it begins, not with the monster, but with the maze, not with the Minotaur, but with the labyrinth that contains him. For the two are inseparable, prison and prisoner, architecture and inhabitant, one unable to exist without the other. Feel the weight of the stone above you, tons upon tons of carefully fitted blocks, each one placed by hands that trembled with the knowledge of what they were building. Daedalus designed this place. Daedalus, the master craftsman. Daedalus, whose genius was both blessing and curse. He designed it too well, creating a prison so perfect that even he, its architect, could barely escape it. The passages fold back upon themselves like thoughts in an anxious mind, like dreams that repeat and repeat but never quite resolve. The air here carries a particular quality, still and heavy, recycled through these passages for so many years that it has forgotten the taste of wind, forgotten the touch of sun. It smells of stone dust and something else, something animal and ancient, a musk that speaks of the creature who walks these halls. But we're not ready to meet him yet. First, we must understand his prison, must feel our way through these passages as countless victims have done before us, must learn the particular horror of being lost in a place designed to destroy your sense of direction, your sense of self. First, the walls, always the walls, pressing in from either side, not quite close enough to touch both at once, not quite far enough apart to feel comfortable. The architects who built this place under Daedalus's direction understood something about human psychology, about the precise distance that creates unease without triggering outright panic. The passages are wide enough to walk comfortably, but narrow enough that you're always aware of them, always conscious of the stone that surrounds you. Then the floor, worn smooth in the center by countless footsteps, but rough at the edges where fewer feet have trod. You can feel the gentle decline, always down, always deeper, though sometimes the passage seems to climb only to descend again more steeply, as if the labyrinth is playing with your sense of vertical space, just as it plays with your horizontal orientation. The floor is not level, not quite, creating a subtle vertigo that compounds with each turn, each choice between passages that all look identical. The ceiling varies in height, sometimes soaring beyond the reach of torchlight, sometimes dropping so low you must duck to continue. This variation is intentional, part of Daedalus's design, meant to disorient, to make you lose track of whether you're on the same level you started or have descended into deeper regions. In some places, you can hear water dripping far above, the sound echoing through vertical shafts that might be air vents or might be something else entirely. The passages branch and merge according to no pattern you can discern. Sometimes you're faced with 3 choices, sometimes 4. Sometimes the passage simply continues with no choice at all, forcing you forward into whatever awaits. The intersections are marked with nothing, no signs, no symbols, no way to know if you've been here before. Every corner looks like every other corner, every stretch of passage identical to the last. Or is it? The mind begins to play tricks, to see patterns where none exist, to recognize landmarks that aren't really there. This is the genius of the labyrinth, that it attacks not just the body, but the mind. It doesn't need to kill you directly. It lets you kill yourself with confusion, with the slow dissolution of hope that comes from being truly, completely lost. The heroes who entered this place came with thread, with chalk, with various methods of marking their path, but the labyrinth seems to swallow these markers, to make them meaningless. A chalk mark on the wall? Was that yours or someone else's from years ago? The thread you've been unspooling? Did it break somewhere behind you? Or is that sound just the wind through passages you can't see? But there is no wind here. That's what you realize after a while. The air is utterly still, moved only by your own passage, by your own breathing, which seems to grow louder the longer you walk. Your footsteps echo, but not in the way footsteps should echo. The sound comes back changed, distorted, as if the labyrinth is digesting the noise and returning something else. Something that sounds almost like footsteps, but not quite. Almost like your footsteps, but not entirely. And then there are the other sounds, the ones that might be imagination or might be real. A distant bellowing that could be wind through stone but sounds too organic, too full of pain and rage. A scraping that might be your own feet shuffling but seems to come from somewhere ahead or behind or above. The labyrinth carries sound in impossible ways, making the far seem near and the near seem far, until you can't trust your own ears any more than you can trust your eyes. The darkness here is absolute in places where no torch reaches. A darkness so complete it seems solid, seems to have weight and presence. Your torch, if you have one, creates a bubble of light that only emphasizes the dark beyond its reach. The shadows dance on the walls, creating shapes that might be cracks in the stone or might be something else, something watching. The labyrinth plays with light the way it plays with sound, with direction, with hope. Time becomes meaningless here. Has it been hours or days since you entered? The sameness of the passages, the absence of any natural light, the constant temperature that never varies, all combine to destroy your sense of temporal progression. You might have been walking in circles for eternity, or you might have just begun. The labyrinth exists outside of time, or perhaps it creates its own time, labyrinth time, measured not in hours, but in the slow erosion of sanity. This is what the young Athenians faced, those 7 youths and 7 maidens sent every 7 years as tribute to King Minos of Crete. Imagine being chosen for this honor, this horror, knowing that you were sailing not to adventure but to almost certain death. The ship that carried them had black sails, the color of mourning, because everyone knew they weren't coming back. They were sailing to feed a monster, but first they had to find him, or let him find them, in this architectural nightmare. The tributes would be released into the labyrinth usually all at once. 14 young people stumbling into darkness, their voices calling to each other at first, trying to stay together. But the labyrinth doesn't allow togetherness. It separates, isolates, divides. The passages that seem to run parallel suddenly diverge. The voice that seemed right beside you is suddenly distant, muffled, gone. One by one, the tributes would find themselves alone, and in that aloneness, the true horror would begin. Because solitude in the labyrinth is not simple solitude. It's a solitude populated by echoes, by the memory of voices, by the knowledge that somewhere in this maze, something else moves with purpose, something that knows these passages intimately, something that doesn't need thread or torch to navigate. The Minotaur is coming, has always been coming, will always be coming, and the labyrinth itself seems to be guiding you toward him, or him toward you. The passages begin to show signs of habitation the deeper you go. Scratches on the walls that might be intentional marks, or the desperate clawing of previous victims. Stains on the floor that might be water damage or something darker. Bones, sometimes, ancient and gnawed, kicked into corners where they gather dust. These signs increase in frequency as you descend, as the passages begin to smell more strongly of that animal musk. As the bellowing grows closer, more frequent, more real. And then, in the distance, but not as distant as you'd like, you hear it. The sound of breathing that isn't yours, heavy and rhythmic, the breathing of something large, something patient, something that has all the time in the world, because this is its world, this maze, this prison that has become a kingdom. The Minotaur is near, or perhaps he's still far, but the labyrinth makes him seem near. Another trick of acoustics and architecture designed to terrorize. The mythology tells us that the Minotaur was born of Queen Pasiphae's unnatural lust for a bull, a lust inspired by Poseidon as punishment for King Minos's hubris. The queen, driven mad by desire, had Daedalus construct a hollow wooden cow so she could mate with the bull. And from this union came Asterion, the Minotaur, a creature with the body of a man, but the head and temperament of a bull. Minos, shamed by this evidence of his wife's transgression and the god's punishment, commanded Daedalus to build the labyrinth to hide this family secret, this living reminder of divine displeasure. But think deeper about what this means. The Minotaur is not just a monster. He is a prince, the stepson of King Minos, technically royalty. His name, Asterion, means starry one, a name full of hope and light given to a creature condemned to eternal darkness. He was a baby once, a child once, probably loved by his mother despite his monstrous form. When did he realize he was different? When did play turn to imprisonment? When did the palace become a prison? The labyrinth was built around him, or he was placed in it young, growing up in these passages, learning their every turn not through exploration, but through endless repetition, endless pacing. This is his nursery, his school, his palace, his prison. Every stone is familiar to him, every echo known, every shadow a companion in his solitude. He doesn't need light to navigate because he's walked these passages in darkness for so long that the map exists in his muscles, in his bones, in the very beat of his hybrid heart. Consider the tragedy of his existence. He has the body of a man with hands that could create, could write, could reach out in friendship, but the head of a bull with thoughts that are neither fully human nor fully animal. What dreams come to such a mind? What understanding of his own condition? Does he remember sunlight, or was he placed here so young that darkness is all he's ever known? Does he understand why the youths are sent to him, or does he simply respond to his nature, to the hunger that drives him? The tributes were his only contact with the outside world, his only visitors, and he killed them. Not out of malice, perhaps, but out of nature, out of the terrible equation of his existence. He was fed human flesh because what else could sustain such a creature? Normal food? The food of men or the food of cattle? Neither would suffice for something that was neither. So he was fed the only thing that seemed to satisfy him. The flesh of the young, the innocent, the sacrificial. But let's return to the immediate, to the passages that grow warmer now, as if the monster's body heat raises the temperature of his domain. The walls here are different, rubbed smooth in places by the passage of his bulk, marked with horn scratches at a height no human could reach. There are hollows worn in the floor where he stops, turns, paces back. This is his territory within the territory, the heart of the labyrinth, where he spends most of his time. You can smell him clearly now, that mix of human sweat and animal musk, a scent that triggers ancient fears in the primitive parts of your brain. Your body knows this smell means danger, means predator, means run. But where can you run in a labyrinth? Every direction might lead toward him or away, and you have no way of knowing which. The passages all lead to the center eventually, or from the center, depending on your perspective, and the Minotaur knows them all. His breathing is louder now, and you can hear the scrape of horn against stone, a sound like fingernails on slate, but deeper, more resonant. He's rubbing his horns against the walls, perhaps to sharpen them, perhaps to mark territory, perhaps simply from boredom, from the endless repetition of days without light, without change, without hope of release. The sound travels through the stone itself, making the walls vibrate slightly, making your teeth ache with its frequency. And then, at a turn that looks like every other turn, in a passage that seems like every other passage, you see him. Or rather, you see his shadow first, enormous and distorted on the wall, cast by some distant light source you can't identify. The shadow moves with purpose, with knowledge, with the confidence of something in its own domain. Then the shadow's source comes into view, and your mind struggles to process what your eyes are seeing. He is larger than you expected, nearly 8 feet tall, with the muscled body of a warrior or a laborer, skin pale from years without sun, but stretched taut over powerful muscles that bunch and release as he moves. But where his neck should continue to a human head, it transitions into the thick neck of a bull, covered in coarse dark hair, supporting a massive head that seems too large for even that powerful body. The horns sweep out and up, ivory white in the dimness, polished from constant rubbing against stone. His eyes, when they fix on you, are the most terrible part. They're neither fully human nor fully bull, but something between, something that suggests understanding trapped behind an inability to communicate. Intelligence imprisoned in a form that can only express itself through violence. They're brown, those eyes, deep brown like rich earth, like the fields of Crete far above, like the eyes of a child who understands he's done something wrong, but not what or why. He doesn't charge immediately. That's what surprises you. He stands there, breathing heavily, his massive chest rising and falling, studying you with those impossible eyes. His hands, perfectly human hands, clench and unclench at his sides. You can see the dirt under his fingernails, the calluses from years of feeling along these walls. He makes a sound, a low rumble that might be speech if his throat could form words, might be a greeting or a warning or a lament. This is the moment the stories don't tell you about. The pause before violence. The space where monster and victim recognize each other as conscious beings, as prisoners of the same fate. You're trapped in the labyrinth by its passages, but he's trapped by something deeper, by his nature, by his birth, by the cosmic joke of his existence. You might escape if you could find the way, but he can never escape. Not from the labyrinth and not from himself. The moment passes, as such moments always do, and nature asserts itself. He bellows, a sound that combines the roar of a bull with something almost human, almost like a scream of frustration or rage or unbearable loneliness. The sound fills the passages, echoes and re-echoes, until it seems like a chorus of monsters, a symphony of anguish. And then he moves, faster than something that large should be able to move, navigating the passages with the ease of long practice. But we're not here to witness violence, not tonight. Tonight, we're here to understand, to explore not just the physical space of the labyrinth, but the psychological space, the mythological space, the symbolic meaning of this place and this creature. The Minotaur represents something fundamental about the human condition, about the beast within us all, about the things we lock away in the labyrinths of our own minds. Think about what the labyrinth really is. A prison built to contain a shame, a physical manifestation of something that should have remained hidden. Every family has its labyrinth, its secret passages where unspoken truths pace like monsters. Every mind has its Minotaur, that part of ourselves we can't quite human and can't quite tame. That hybrid of instinct and intelligence that we feed with sacrifice but never quite satisfy. The labyrinth is also a meditation on the nature of knowledge and ignorance. Those who enter it ignorant of its layout are doomed, but even knowledge doesn't guarantee salvation. Daedalus knew every passage, had designed every turn, but still needed wings to escape. The Minotaur knows every stone, every echo, but his knowledge is also his prison. He can never not know the labyrinth, never see it with fresh eyes, never hope that the next turn might lead to freedom. And what of Theseus, the hero who eventually slays the Minotaur? He enters the labyrinth not with superior strength or courage, but with thread, with a simple technology that turns the maze's complexity against itself. Ariadne gives him this thread, Ariadne, who is the Minotaur's half-sister, who betrays her family's secret for love. The thread is like consciousness itself, a thin line of continuity that allows us to venture into the darkness of the unconscious and still find our way back. But consider this. When Theseus kills the Minotaur, what really dies? The monster? Or the possibility of reconciliation between our human and animal natures? The labyrinth remains after the Minotaur's death, empty but not destroyed, waiting perhaps for a new monster, a new shame to hide. The structure outlasts its inhabitant, suggesting that the real monster might be the labyrinth itself, the tendency to create complex prisons for simple truths. The passages continue beyond the Minotaur's usual domain, extending into regions even he rarely explores. These deeper passages are older, cut by different hands, perhaps predating even Daedalus's design. They connect to natural caves, to underground rivers, to spaces that exist between the human-made and the natural, between architecture and geology. Here, the labyrinth becomes something else, something more primal than even the Minotaur himself. Water runs through some of these passages, black water that has never seen sunlight, carrying blind fish and pale crawling things that have evolved in eternal darkness. The sound of this water is constant, a whisper that might be the labyrinth talking to itself, telling stories older than Crete, older than Greece, as old as the first time humans ventured underground and felt the weight of the earth above them. There are chambers down here, vast chambers where the labyrinth opens into natural caverns, where stalactites and stalagmites create their own maze, a labyrinth within a labyrinth. The Minotaur sometimes comes here. You can see his tracks in the wet clay. But even he seems uncomfortable in these spaces, preferring his familiar passages to these natural voids. Perhaps even monsters need boundaries, need the comfort of walls, need to know where they end and the world begins. The mythology tells us that after Theseus escaped the labyrinth, he forgot to change his ship's sails from black to white, causing his father Aegeus to believe him dead and throw himself into the sea in grief. This forgetting seems strange for a hero flush with victory unless we understand it symbolically. Perhaps Theseus couldn't change the sails because something fundamental had changed in him, something that made the morning colors appropriate. Perhaps everyone who enters the labyrinth, even those who escape, carries some of its darkness with them forever. The labyrinth connects to everything when you think about it. Every maze, every puzzle, every complex problem we face is a reflection of that original labyrinth. Every time we feel lost, every time we retrace our steps, every time we realize we've been going in circles, we're walking those ancient passages. The Minotaur is dead, if he ever truly lived. But the labyrinth remains, not in Crete, but in consciousness itself, in the very structure of thought and memory and dream. As we prepare to leave these passages, to emerge into what passes for open air in the world of monsters, consider one last aspect of the labyrinth: its silence when empty. Without the Minotaur's breathing, without footsteps, without the drip of water or the whisper of wind, the labyrinth becomes perfectly, absolutely silent. This silence is perhaps more terrible than any monster because it suggests the ultimate truth of the labyrinth. It doesn't need a monster to be monstrous. The maze itself is the real terror, the possibility of being lost, of losing oneself, of becoming something that needs to be contained. The passages begin to ascend now, the stone growing lighter, the air slightly fresher. Somewhere above, the world continues, unaware or uncaring of the labyrinth beneath. Ships sail the Mediterranean, olives ripen on trees, children play in the streets of Athens and Knossos. But beneath it all, the labyrinth waits, patient as stone, complex as thought, ready to receive whatever monster, whatever shame, whatever truth needs to be hidden away. We emerge, but we don't really escape. No one really escapes the labyrinth. We carry it with us, in the convolutions of our brains, in the twisted passages of our dreams, in the way we sometimes pace the same thoughts over and over, going nowhere, trapped in the maze of our own making. The Minotaur is dead, but we are all, in our own ways, both monster and maze, both prisoner and prison, both the thread leading out and the darkness that swallows it. But now the scene shifts. The stone gives way to water, and we find ourselves standing on the deck of a ship, staring ahead at a narrow strait where the sea itself has become a monster, where navigation becomes nightmare, where sailors must choose not between safety and danger, but between two different forms of destruction. The salt spray catches your face before you even see the strait, carried on a wind that seems to blow from all directions at once, a wind that shouldn't exist according to any natural law of weather. This is your first warning that you're approaching waters where nature itself has been twisted into something malevolent, where the very elements conspire against navigation, against survival, against hope. The ship beneath your feet groans with a sound that wood should not make, a sound almost like fear, as if the vessel itself knows what lies ahead. Through the mist that perpetually shrouds these waters, you begin to see the narrow passage between Sicily and the Italian mainland. Though it looks nothing like the tourist destination it will become millennia from now. Here, in the age of monsters, the strait is barely wide enough for a ship to pass, and the waters churn with unnatural currents, with whirlpools that appear and disappear without warning, with waves that move against the wind, against reason, against everything sailors know about the sea. The captain, if there is a captain brave or foolish enough to attempt this passage, stands rigid at the helm, his knuckles white as he grips the wheel. He's heard the stories, every sailor has, but stories are one thing, and reality is another. The reality is that the strait is impossible to avoid if you're sailing these waters. unless you're willing to add weeks to your journey, to risk other dangers, other monsters. So ships attempt the passage, and some survive, enough to keep commerce flowing, enough to maintain the illusion that skill and courage might be enough. But they're not enough, never enough, because this strait doesn't follow the rules. The water here is different from normal seawater, thicker somehow, darker, with an oily quality that makes it cling to oars, to hulls, to anything it touches. It tastes wrong too, the sailors say, those who've been splashed by it and lived to tell. Not just salty, but bitter, metallic, like blood mixed with brine, like the sea itself is wounded here, bleeding from some ancient injury that will never heal. The first sign of Charybdis is the sound, a deep thrumming that you feel more than hear, a vibration that comes up through the ship's hull and into your bones. It's rhythmic, this thrumming, like a massive heartbeat, like breathing, like the sea itself has developed lungs and is using them. 3 times a day, the ancient sources tell us, Charybdis swallows the sea, drinks it down into some unimaginable depth, and 3 times a day, she vomits it back up in a water spout that reaches toward the sky. But the ancient sources don't tell you about the waiting, about the hours between these catastrophic events, when the sea seems almost normal, almost navigable, lulling sailors into thinking they might slip through while the monster sleeps. They don't tell you how the water begins to spiral slowly at first. So slowly you might not notice until it's too late. Until the current has you. Until the spiral tightens and quickens and becomes inexorable. The whirlpool, when it forms fully, is a perfect spiral of destruction, a liquid tornado that extends down into depths no one has ever measured and lived to report. The water at its edges moves with such force that it strips bark from oars, pulls nails from planks, tears sails from masts. And at its center, that terrible center where the water disappears into darkness, you can sometimes see things that shouldn't be there. The fragments of ships from different eras all mixed together. Bronze Age vessels crushed against Roman galleys, Greek triremes tangled with Phoenician merchants. Charybdis herself, if we can call this force a her, is never seen, not entirely. Sometimes, in the moment before the whirlpool forms, sailors report seeing something vast and dark beneath the water. A shadow that might be a mouth, might be a throat, might be something that has no name in any human language. The old stories say she was once a woman, cursed by Zeus for her greed, transformed into this living vortex, this appetite that can never be satisfied. The transformation, think about the transformation, to go from having a body, a form, boundaries, to becoming pure hunger, pure consumption, pure negation. Charybdis doesn't just swallow water. She swallows existence itself, unmakes things, reduces ships and sailors, and even the sea itself to nothing, to absence, to void. She is entropy given form, or rather given formlessness, a moving hole in reality that threatens to expand until it swallows everything. When she releases the water, when she vomits it back into the world, it comes changed. The fish that survive passage through her are different, mutated, with too many eyes or not enough, with scales that shimmer with colors that shouldn't exist. The wood from destroyed ships comes back, bleached white as bone, soft as cloth, wrong in every possible way. Even the water itself seems traumatized, if water can be traumatized, moving in patterns that defy physics, that suggest it remembers its journey through whatever Charybdis is or has become. But If Charybdis is terrifying in her vast impersonality, in her reduction of everything to pure consumption, then Scylla is terrifying in exactly the opposite way. Scylla is personal, targeted, specific. She chooses her victims, selects them with an intelligence that makes her predation feel like murder rather than feeding. She waits in her cave halfway up the cliff face on the opposite side of the strait, and she watches, always watches, with eyes that see too much, understand too much, hate too much. The cave is perfectly positioned, high enough that no ship can reach it to attack her, low enough that her heads, those 6 terrible heads on their serpentine necks, can reach down to snatch sailors from the decks of passing ships. The rock around her cave is stained with substances best not examined too closely, streaked with colors that might be rust, might be blood, might be something else entirely. Strange plants grow here, feeding on whatever nutrients her presence provides. Twisted things with thorns like teeth and leaves that seem to track movement. Scylla's heads are never still, always weaving back and forth, in and out, creating a hypnotic pattern that draws the eye even as the mind screams to look away. Each head is different, though all are horrible. One might have too many eyes, another too many teeth, a third, a mouth that opens sideways instead of up and down. They don't coordinate their movements, suggesting that each head has its own consciousness, its own hunger, its own particular form of malevolence. The sound she makes is worse than her appearance, a harmony of howls that shouldn't harmonize but do, creating a music that makes sailors want to steer closer even as they know it means death. It's not a siren's song, not a beautiful lure, but something more primal, more honest. It's the sound of hunger and rage and loss, all mixed together. The sound of something that was once beautiful and knows it, remembers it, and hates everything that still possesses what she has lost. Because Scylla, like Charybdis, was transformed, was cursed, was changed from something else into this monstrosity. The stories vary, but most agree she was once beautiful, a nymph loved by a sea god, transformed either by a jealous rival or by her own choices into this thing that exists only to destroy. Her cave extends deep into the cliff, and some say that in its deepest reaches, you can still find remnants of her former life. A mirror that reflects nothing, jewelry that turns to seaweed when touched, love letters written in languages that predate Greek. The transformation happened in water, in a pool where she bathed, where the herbs of transformation were dissolved by Circe's hand, Circe who loved the same sea god, Circe who knew the ways of change, of turning one thing into another. Imagine that moment, stepping into familiar water and feeling it burn, not with heat, but with change, with fundamental alteration, feeling your body rebel against itself, split, multiply, diverge into something that should not be able to exist but does. The 6 heads didn't come all at once. First, there was stretching, elongation, a neck that grew too long, too flexible. Then division, like a plant branching, but this was flesh, was consciousness splitting into multiple awarenesses. Each head, as it formed, brought its own hunger, its own voice, its own particular fury. And below, where her legs should be, the transformation was different, but no less horrible. Flesh becoming something between dog and fish and serpent. 12 legs that could grip rock, could propel her through water, could hold her suspended between elements. She remembers being beautiful. That's the cruelest part of the curse. She has perfect memory of every admirer, every compliment, every reflection in still water that showed her perfect face. Now she has 6 faces, none of them perfect, all of them hungry, and the memory of beauty makes the monstrosity worse. She can see herself reflected in the terror of Sailor's eyes, 6 distorted images of what she has become, and each reflection is a fresh wound, a new reminder of loss. The strait forces sailors to choose between these 2 dooms, but the choice isn't equal, isn't balanced. Charybdis will certainly destroy your entire ship, swallow it whole, leave nothing. Scylla will take 6 men, exactly 6, 1 for each head, but the ship might survive, might make it through. So the choice becomes a calculation of acceptable losses, a mathematics of sacrifice. How many men is a ship worth? How many lives for the chance of survival? Odysseus faced this choice, clever Odysseus who had survived so much already. Circe had warned him, told him the terrible arithmetic of the strait. Hug Scylla's rock, she advised. Lose 6 men rather than your whole ship to Charybdis. But knowing what must be done and doing it are different things. Ordering your ship toward a monster, knowing you're choosing which of your men will die, knowing the names, their faces, their stories, and sailing toward their doom anyway because the alternative is worse. The approach to Scylla's cliff is marked by bones, not scattered randomly, but arranged almost artistically, as if she takes pride in her kills, as if she's creating a gallery of destruction. Skulls wedged into cracks in the rock, rib cages hanging like grotesque wind chimes, femurs crossed in patterns that might be warnings or might be invitations. The bones are all different ages, some ancient and bleached white, others still fresh. As your ship draws closer, forced by the need to avoid Charybdis's pull, you can smell her. It's not the smell of an animal, not exactly. It's the smell of transformation gone wrong, of flesh that can't decide what it wants to be, of hunger that has become a physical substance. It's sweet and rotten at the same time, marine and terrestrial, alive and dead. The smell gets into your clothes, your hair, your dreams if you survive to dream again. She watches your approach with intelligence, with strategy. She can tell which sailors are strongest, which are most vital to the ship's operation. Sometimes she takes the helmsman, sometimes the navigator, sometimes the youngest, just for the cruelty of it. Her heads confer with each other in a language of hisses and howls, deciding, planning, savoring the anticipation. The waiting is part of her pleasure, the slow approach of ships that have no choice but to come within reach. When she strikes, it's with impossible speed and precision. The necks extend further than should be possible, the heads moving independently but with shared purpose. Each head takes 1 man, always 1, never more, never less, as if there's a cosmic law governing her feeding. The men don't always die immediately. Sometimes she holds them, suspended above the water, letting them struggle, letting their shipmates see, letting everyone understand the price of passage. The sound of her feeding carries across the water, wet sounds, crushing sounds, sounds that will follow the survivors for the rest of their lives. Those who escape, who make it through the strait with only 6 empty spaces where friends once stood, they never really escape. They carry the sound with them, hear it in the cracking of bones at dinner, in the splash of water against hulls, in the cries of seabirds that sound almost but not quite like human screams. But there's more to the strait than just the monsters. The space between them, that narrow passage where ships must sail, has its own qualities, its own dangers. The water here has been traumatized by centuries of violence, by the constant presence of unnatural forces. It moves wrong, forms waves that shouldn't exist, creates currents that push ships toward one monster or the other, as if the sea itself has chosen sides. Or perhaps it's trying to feed both its children equally. Strange things live in these waters, things that aren't quite fish, aren't quite anything nameable. They've adapted to the presence of monsters, evolved in the shadow of Scylla and the pool of Charybdis. Some have developed transparency, becoming living glass to avoid notice. Others have grown armor, shells that can withstand crushing pressure, teeth that can bite through bronze. They feed on the remnants of destruction, on the bodies that sink between the monsters, on the fear that saturates the water like blood. The light is wrong in the strait too. Even at noon, it seems filtered, dimmed, as if the sun itself is reluctant to fully illuminate what happens here. Shadows fall in directions that don't match the sun's position, and sometimes there are shadows with no source, moving across the water like the ghosts of ships that died here, still trying to navigate the passage, still trying to escape. Sailors who've survived the strait report time distortions, moments that stretch like hours, hours that pass in heartbeats. Some say they've seen other ships in the passage, ships that shouldn't be there, that couldn't be there. Ancient vessels sailing alongside them for a moment before vanishing. Others report hearing voices in languages that predate any known tongue, giving warnings or perhaps prayers. It's impossible to tell which. The wind in the strait is particular, shaped by the cliffs, by the monster's presence, by forces meteorologists will never be able to explain. It pushes ships toward Scylla when Charybdis feeds, toward Charybdis when Scylla reaches for her prey, as if trying to maintain some terrible balance. Sometimes the wind stops entirely, leaving ships becalmed in the worst possible place, forced to use oars, to exhaust themselves rowing through danger when they need all their strength for survival. At night, the strait becomes something else entirely. Charybdis glows faintly when she feeds, a phosphorescent light from deep below that illuminates the whirlpool from within, showing its full, terrible depth. Scylla's eyes shine in the darkness, 12 or more points of light that track every movement on the water. Some sailors say there are other lights too under the water, in the caves, lights that might be other monsters or might be the ghosts of the drowned, or might be something else, something older than both monsters, something that was here first and will be here last. The mythology tells us that eventually Heracles will kill Scylla, but she will be resurrected by her father, the sea god Phorcys, because some monsters are necessary, some horrors serve a purpose in the cosmic order. The strait needs its guardians, needs its impossibility, needs to remain a place where safe passage is never guaranteed, where the sea reminds humanity that there are forces beyond control, beyond understanding, beyond negotiation. Even gods avoid the strait when they can. Poseidon, master of the seas, takes other routes. Zeus's thunderbolts have no effect on Charybdis's hunger or Scylla's rage. The monsters here exist outside divine law, in a space between order and chaos, between sea and land, between life and death. They are liminal beings in a liminal space, marking a boundary that is both geographical and metaphysical. Consider what the strait represents: the impossible choice, the decision with no good options. the place where you must lose something to gain something else. Every major decision in life is a navigation between Scylla and Charybdis, between two different disasters, two different losses. Do you sacrifice the few to save the many? Do you choose the known horror over the unknown? Do you accept partial loss to avoid total destruction? The merchants who regularly sail these waters develop rituals, superstitions, ways of coping with the repeated trauma of passage. Some throw offerings to both monsters before entering the strait, livestock or wine or gold, though there's no evidence this helps. Others paint eyes on their ship's prows, hoping to outstare Scylla, to make her heads confused about which eyes are real. Still others sing while passing through, not to calm the monsters, but to calm themselves, to have something to do besides wait for death. There are maps of the strait, attempts to chart the safest passage, but they're all different, all contradictory. The strait changes, or seems to change, as if the monsters move, as if the very geography is unstable. What was safe passage last month might be death this month. The only constant is danger, is loss, is the certainty that something will be taken from you if you dare these waters. Some philosophers will later argue that the strait is necessary, that without it, sailors would forget the sea's power, would become arrogant, would challenge forces even greater than Scylla and Charybdis. The strait teaches humility, teaches acceptance of loss, teaches that survival sometimes means choosing the lesser evil rather than seeking the impossible good. It's a harsh lesson written in salt water and blood, but perhaps a necessary one. The water beyond the strait, once you've passed through, if you're fortunate enough to pass through, seems impossibly calm, impossibly normal. Regular waves, regular wind, regular fish going about their regular lives. It's almost insulting, this normalcy, after what you've witnessed, what you've survived, what you've lost. Some sailors break down here, in the calm water past the strait, finally able to release the tension they've been holding, finally able to mourn the 6 who were taken, or celebrate that it was only 6. But we must move on now, leaving the impossible waters of the strait, leaving Scylla in her cave still hungry after her feeding, leaving Charybdis to her eternal cycle of consumption and regurgitation. Our path takes us inland now, to a temple that was once sacred, once pure, once a place of worship and peace. But curses change everything, transform not just people but places, and the temple where Medusa dwells has become something that makes even monsters uncomfortable. A place where the very air can kill, where looking becomes dying, where beauty and horror have become so intertwined that they can never be separated again. The grass dies first. That's what tells you you're approaching the temple. Long before you see its broken columns rising from the hillside like bones from earth. The grass goes from green to yellow to gray to nothing, an expanding circle of death with the temple at its center. No birds fly over this dead zone. No insects buzz in the air. Even the wind seems to hold its breath as it passes through, as if afraid of what it might carry away with it. The silence here is different from ordinary silence. It's the silence of a place that has been abandoned by life itself, rejected by nature, cursed so thoroughly that even the earth beneath has given up trying to support anything growing, anything living, anything that might challenge the desolation. The path to the temple, once a sacred way lined with statues of gods and heroes, is now something else entirely. The statues are still there, but they're different. Too lifelike, too detailed, too perfect in their capture of a single moment of absolute terror. These aren't the idealized forms of classical sculpture. These are people, real people, frozen in the instant they realized their doom. A merchant reaching for a sword he'll never draw, a priestess with her mouth open in a scream that will never sound, a child whose toys lie scattered at stone feet that will never move again. The detail is impossible. Impossible for any sculptor to achieve. You can see individual hairs, the texture of cloth, the pores in skin that has become marble. Some of the statues have been here so long that weather has begun to work on them, erosion softening features, rain pooling in the hollows of eyes that will never blink again. But others are newer, so new that you can still see the dust of the road on their stone sandals, still see the sweat of fear crystallized on their stone brows. The temple itself rises from this garden of frozen death like a wounded animal, once beautiful, now broken, but still somehow magnificent in its ruin. It was dedicated to Athena, goddess of wisdom, goddess of war, goddess who should have protected those who served here but didn't, couldn't, or wouldn't. The columns that remain standing lean at angles that architecture shouldn't allow, as if the very geometry of the place has been corrupted. The marble, once white as sea foam, has taken on other colors, greens and purples and blacks that marble shouldn't possess, stains that suggest corruption from within rather than without. The pediment, that triangular space above the columns where scenes of divine glory once played out in stone relief, has partially collapsed. But what remains shows something wrong. Something changed. The figures there have been altered, their faces turned away, their hands raised as if to ward off something, as if even stone representations of gods can't bear to look at what dwells within. Zeus's eagle has its wings covering its head, Athena's owl has turned its back, and in the center, where Athena herself once stood triumphant, there's just a void, a space where the stone has been removed or destroyed or perhaps simply ceased to exist. The great bronze doors, those massive barriers that once required 6 strong men to open, now hang askew on broken hinges, one fallen completely, the other creaking in winds that shouldn't exist in this dead air. Through the gap, darkness waits, but it's not ordinary darkness. It's the darkness of a place where light goes to die, where shadows have substance, where the absence of illumination is an active force rather than a passive state. The threshold is marked with warnings in a dozen languages, carved desperately into the stone by those who survived close encounters or by the friends of those who didn't. Look not upon her, one says in ancient Greek. Shield your eyes, warns another in Latin. She was beautiful once, reads a third in a script so old its meaning has to be guessed. But the warnings are unnecessary because the statues tell the story more eloquently than words ever could. Inside, if you're foolish enough to enter, if you're brave enough or desperate enough or simply tired enough of life to cross that threshold, the temple reveals itself as a place of systematic destruction. The sacred pool where priestesses once performed ritual ablutions is still there, but the water is black, viscous, moving with its own sluggish current despite having no inlet or outlet. Things live in that water, or perhaps live is the wrong word. Things exist in that water, things that have adapted to the cursed environment, things that feed on the fragments of humanity that sometimes wash into their domain. The altar still stands in the center of the main chamber, the altar where offerings were once made to Athena, where prayers rose with incense smoke, where the sacred and the mortal met in ritual communion. But the altar has been defiled, not with blood or violence, but with something worse, with the evidence of divine abandonment. The sacred flame that should burn eternal has been replaced by a different kind of light, a phosphorescent glow that comes from fungi growing on the altar stone, fungi that pulse with their own rhythm, their own purpose, their own terrible life. The walls, once decorated with frescoes depicting Athena's victories, her wisdom, her guidance of heroes, now show something else. The paint has run, bled, reformed into new patterns that hurt to perceive, that suggest stories no human mind should contemplate. In some places, the frescoes seem to move when you're not looking directly at them. Figures shifting position, scenes progressing through narratives that always end the same way, in stone, in stillness, in the death that comes from looking at what should not be seen. The inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, where only the highest priestesses were once permitted, is where she dwells. The approach to it is lined with mirrors, hundreds of them, bronze and silver and polished stone, all carefully positioned, all perfectly angled to show you everything except what you must not see. The mirrors are a mercy and a torment, allowing you to navigate while reminding you constantly of the danger, of the thing that must be avoided, of the gaze that kills. She moves through these mirrors like a ghost, a flutter at the edge of reflection, a shadow that doesn't match anything casting it. You can track her movement by the sound that anyone who's been near snakes knows, but magnified, multiplied. The dry sliding of scales on stone, but not just on the floor, on the walls, on the ceiling, as if gravity has no hold on her, as if she exists in a different relationship with space than normal beings. But it's the other sound that truly disturbs, the sound of her breathing, because it's human breathing, a woman's breathing, sometimes calm, sometimes ragged with emotion that might be rage or might be grief, or might be both. And occasionally, heartbreakingly, the sound of weeping, quiet sobs that echo through the temple like the lament of the place itself for what it once was, for what she once was, for what was lost in the transformation. Medusa. Her name means guardian or protectress, a cosmic irony given what she's become. She was a priestess here, devoted to Athena, sworn to chastity, dedicated to wisdom and warfare in their purest forms. Beautiful? Yes, famously beautiful, with hair that caught sunlight like spun gold, eyes the color of the Aegean at its clearest, a face that poets would later struggle to describe because all their words fell short. Poseidon saw her here, in this temple, and wanted her with the casual entitlement of gods. The stories differ on whether she consented or was forced, but the result was the same. Defilement in Athena's sacred space, mortality touched by divinity in a place where such touching was forbidden. And Athena's response, Athena's justice, fell not on her uncle Poseidon, who had done the defiling, but on Medusa, who had been defiled. The transformation was not instant, not merciful. It began with the hair, each strand thickening, hardening, developing its own consciousness, its own venomous purpose. Imagine feeling your hair become alive, become other, become weapon. Then the skin, scaling in places, remaining human in others, creating a patchwork of what was and what is. The eyes changed last. Those beautiful eyes becoming the instruments of death, cursed to kill whatever they looked upon, cursed to never again see another living face except in the moment of its petrification. She remembers everything from before. That's part of the curse. She remembers every sunset she watched from the temple steps, every prayer she offered with sincere devotion, every friend she laughed with, every small joy of mortal life. She remembers them perfectly, and the memories hurt worse than any physical transformation, because they remind her of what she can never have again, never be again, never return to, no matter how much she might want to. The snakes that replaced her hair are not just appendages, but companions, the only companions she can have. Each one has its own personality, its own preferences, its own way of moving. Some are aggressive, striking at shadows, always ready for violence. Others are almost gentle, nuzzling against her cheek in what might be comfort, might be the closest thing to affection she can experience now. They hiss in harmonies that form a kind of music, a kind of communication, telling her things about the world she can no longer safely look at directly. She's learned to navigate by sound, by smell, by the vibrations in the stone beneath her feet. She knows every crack in every tile, every echo of every chamber, every draft that moves through the broken temple. This is her world now, three-dimensional but experienced without sight, or rather with sight that must always be controlled, contained, directed away from anything she doesn't want to destroy. Sometimes she practices looking at things that are already stone, the statues that fill her temple, trying to remember what it was like to see without killing. But stone doesn't satisfy the curse, doesn't provide the release that comes from transformation. The curse demands life, demands the moment of meeting, the instant when eyes lock and understanding dawns just before it ends. The heroes come, have always come, will always come. They come with their polished shields and the divine weapons and their certainty that they're the protagonist of the story. They come to take her head, because even in death, her gaze retains its power, making her head the ultimate weapon. They never consider that she might not want to die, or worse, that she might want to die but can't, that the curse might include its own preservation, its own insistence on continued existence. Perseus came with his mirror shield and his winged sandals and his divine parentage that made him think he had the right. He succeeded where others failed, not through strength, but through not looking, through reducing her to a reflection, to an image, to something less than real. He cut off her head while she slept, the only time the snakes were quiet, the only time she could have something like peace. But even that wasn't an ending. Her head retained its power, became a weapon in Perseus's hands, and later on Athena's shield. Her body birthed Pegasus and Chrysaea, because divine curse and divine rape combined to create impossible offspring. And some say her spirit remains in the temple, that on certain nights you can hear her walking the halls she once walked as a priestess, looking for her head, looking for wholeness, looking for an ending that never comes. The temple has become something more than just her dwelling. It's become an extension of her curse. The stones themselves have absorbed centuries of petrifying power, developing their own ability to freeze, to stop, to make permanent. Water that pools here turns to stone. Plants that try to grow crystallize into mineral formations. Even the air itself sometimes solidifies into sheets of transparent stone that shatter at a touch, raining down like deadly snow. The lower levels of the temple, the crypts and storage chambers beneath, have become something else entirely. Here, the curse has had time to work on the very structure of reality. Rooms that should be square are circular. Passages that should lead out led further in. The darkness here has weight, substance, presence. Things live in this darkness that have never seen light, that have evolved in the presence of the curse, that have become cursed themselves in ways that no mythology records. There are whispers that Medusa sometimes descends to these lower levels, not to hide, but to be among things that don't fear her, that can't fear her, because they have no eyes to meet hers. Here she might find something like companionship among the eyeless crawling things, the blind, pale creatures that have adapted to eternal darkness. Here she might pretend for a moment that she's not alone, that there are others who understand what it's like to be transformed beyond recognition, beyond redemption, beyond hope. The curse extends beyond the physical, beyond the visible. Those who spend too long near the temple, even without entering, even without seeing her, report changes. They dream of snakes, of stone, of eyes that see too much. They find themselves avoiding mirrors, flinching at their own reflections, wondering if the curse might be contagious, might spread through proximity or sympathy, or simply through understanding too much about what happened here. The temple remembers. The temple endures. The temple waits. It waits for more heroes, more victims, more additions to its gallery of stone. It waits for the curse to end, though it might have forgotten what ending means. It waits for Athena to return, to forgive, to lift the punishment she placed on her priestess for the crime of being desired by a god. But gods don't forgive, don't reconsider, don't admit error, so the temple waits forever, and Medusa waits within it, and the statues wait in their frozen fear, and the curse continues its slow work of transformation. As we prepare to leave this place of frozen death and corrupted sanctity, consider what Medusa represents. The victim punished for her victimization, beauty transformed into weapon, the guardian who can no longer guard because her very presence is destruction. She is isolation made manifest, the inability to connect, to touch, to see and be seen without consequence. She is what happens when the god's justice is unjust, when protection becomes persecution, when the very thing that should save you becomes the thing that damns you. The temple recedes behind us, but its influence lingers. Stone dust in our clothes, the memory of absolute silence, the knowledge that there are places where mercy doesn't reach, where curses take root and grow like poisonous gardens. We carry a bit of that curse with us, as everyone does who comes close enough to understand that Medusa is not the monster in this story, or not the only one, or not the original one. But now we must continue our journey, leaving the dead zone of the temple, returning to lands where things still grow, where water still flows, where death comes in more conventional forms. We travel south to where the land becomes wet, becomes treacherous, becomes the domain of something that multiplies with every attempt to destroy it. The swamps of Lerna await, and in their poisonous waters, something stirs that has too many heads to count and too much life to kill. The swamp announces itself through scent long before you see the first diseased tree or corrupted pool. A smell that enters not just through your nose, but through your pores, your mouth, seeming to coat your lungs with each breath you take. It is the smell of rot perfected, of decay elevated to an art form. of poison so pure it has achieved its own terrible beauty. This is not the simple stench of death, but something more complex, more nuanced, a symphony of putrefaction where each note has been carefully cultivated over centuries of toxic evolution. The air itself feels heavier here, thick with moisture that isn't quite water, droplets that hang suspended, too corrupted to fall, too heavy to rise, creating a perpetual mist that obscures vision and infiltrates everything it touches. The trees, those few that still stand, have been transformed by their proximity to the Hydra's domain into something that shouldn't exist. Twisted sculptures of wood and poison that define the boundaries between the merely dangerous and the absolutely lethal. Their bark weeps a substance that might be sap, but behaves like acid, eating through whatever it touches with patient, inexorable hunger. The leaves, black even in full sunlight, photosynthesize not light, but darkness, drawing in shadow and exhaling poison, creating their own microclimate of toxicity. Birds that land on these branches are found days later, perfectly preserved, but dead, their bodies converted into vessels for the poison that now fills them, that transforms them into warning signs that go unheeded by the next generation of birds who will meet the same fate. The water, if we can call it water, moves without current, shifts without wind, ripples without cause. It has achieved a consistency somewhere between liquid and solid, too thick to be water, too fluid to be mud, existing in a state that physics would deny, but chemistry, twisted chemistry, corrupted chemistry makes possible. The surface reflects nothing correctly, showing not what is, but what might be, what will be if you stay too long, if you breathe too deeply, if you let the swamp's influence seep into your bones, your blood, your brain. Sometimes faces appear in these reflections, faces of those who ventured here before you, faces transformed by poison into expressions of eternal suffering, eternal warning, eternal regret. The bog extends for miles in every direction, though direction itself becomes meaningless in a place where every pool looks identical, where every stand of dying reeds could be the same stand you passed an hour ago, or a different one entirely. The swamp doesn't follow the rules of normal geography, normal space. It exists in its own pocket of reality, where distance is measured not in steps, but in stages of poisoning, where you can walk for hours and find yourself back where you started, or walk for minutes and find yourself impossibly deep in territories that maps insist don't exist. Beneath the surface, things move that have evolved in this toxic paradise, creatures that shouldn't be able to live but do, that shouldn't be able to reproduce but flourish. Fish with too many eyes and not enough fins swim through the poisonous medium, their bodies translucent, showing organs that pulse with colors that don't appear in nature, that shouldn't appear anywhere. Eels that have forgotten how to die writhe in endless knots, their bodies regenerating faster than the poison can dissolve them, creating a perpetual cycle of destruction and renewal that mirrors something larger, something worse, something with multiple heads that grows stronger with every attempt to kill it. The insects here have achieved their own perfection of horror. Mosquitoes whose proboscises inject poison rather than draw blood. Flies that lay eggs, which hatch into more flies before they've even left the parent's body, creating clouds of exponentially expanding pestilence. Spiders weave webs from silk that burns whatever touches it, their patterns forming symbols that hurt to perceive. that suggest meanings the human mind rejects, but the reptilian brain recognizes, remembers from genetic memories older than consciousness. The reeds that grow in the shallower parts of the swamp are sharp enough to cut flesh, but that's not their true danger. They whisper constantly, a sound like wind through grass, but wrong, backwards, as if the sound is being drawn into them rather than created by them. If you listen too long, and it's hard not to listen in the oppressive silence between their whispers, you begin to understand that they're speaking, that they have something to say, something about the nature of multiplication, about problems that grow worse with every solution, about the mathematics of doom that governs this place. Paths through the swamp exist, but they're not reliable, not stable. A solid-seeming tussock that supports your weight one moment might dissolve the next, dropping you into water that burns, that clings, that tries to convert you into itself. The safe routes change, or seem to change, as if the swamp rearranges itself according to principles that might be random, or might be malevolent, or might be something worse than either, something intentional, something intelligent, something that has plans for those who enter its domain. The Hydra's presence permeates everything here, even when the creature itself remains hidden in the deeper pools, in the places where the water becomes truly black, truly toxic, where even the adapted life of the swamp fears to go. You know it's there by the bubbles that rise without pattern, each one releasing a cloud of gas that kills birds flying overhead, that withers plants on the bank, that adds another layer to the atmosphere of poison that defines this place. You know it's there, by the way. The water sometimes moves against itself, currents flowing in impossible directions as something vast shifts beneath the surface. The mythology tells us the Hydra has 9 heads, but the mythology is wrong or simplified, or perhaps the number changes. Sometimes there are 7, sometimes 11, sometimes too many, to count in the confusion of battle, in the terror of confrontation. The central head is immortal, cannot be killed by any mortal weapon, cannot be destroyed by any force available to humanity. The other heads are mortal, but that mortality is meaningless when cutting one causes 2 to grow in its place. When destruction leads to multiplication, when every victory becomes a greater defeat. But the heads are just the most visible part of the horror. The body that supports them is vast, serpentine, covered in scales that aren't quite scales, more like plates of crystallized poison that constantly shed and regrow, each one a weapon, each one toxic enough to kill with a touch. The body extends deep into the swamp, perhaps through the swamp. Perhaps the swamp itself is part of the body, an extension of the Hydra that has grown beyond its original form, that has become landscape, become ecosystem, become world unto itself. The Hydra moves through its domain not like a creature swimming, but like the domain itself, shifting, rearranging, expressing a different aspect of its nature. When it surfaces, truly surfaces with intent rather than just to breathe. The swamp responds, the water pulling back as if in reverence or fear, the poisonous plants bending away, the very air becoming more toxic, as if celebrating the appearance of its source, its creator, its God. Each head has its own personality, its own particular form of malevolence. One might spit poison in a stream that can reach impossible distances, arcing through the air in defiance of physics. Another might breathe out clouds of gas that cause hallucinations, that make you see the swamp as beautiful, inviting, safe, drawing you deeper into danger. heard might sing, actually sing in a voice that sounds almost human, almost beautiful, but wrong in frequencies that human ears weren't meant to process, that human brains weren't meant to interpret. The immortal head, the central head, is different from the others, not just in its indestructibility, but in its awareness. It watches with intelligence that goes beyond animal cunning, that suggests understanding of its own nature, its own purpose, its own cosmic role as the problem that can't be solved, the challenge that can't be overcome through conventional means. Its eyes, when they fix on you, convey not just hunger or aggression, but something like pity, like it knows something about your fate that you don't, like it sees your future and finds it either amusing or sad, or both. Heracles came here, greatest of Greek heroes, came with his nephew Iolaus and his divine strength and his determination to complete his labors. He thought he could solve the Hydra through strength, through the direct application of force that had worked so well on other monsters. But the Hydra taught him, teaches everyone, that some problems can't be punched into submission, that some challenges require thinking beyond the obvious, beyond the straightforward, beyond the heroic. For every head Heracles severed, two grew back, and each new head was angry, was fresh, was hungry. The multiplication wasn't just numerical, but exponential in fury, in toxicity, in determination to destroy this hero who thought he could win through simple violence. The swamp itself joined the battle, the ground becoming less solid under Heracles' feet, the air becoming more poisonous with each swing of his club, the water rising to protect its master, its child, its expression of liquid malevolence. It was Iolaus who provided the solution. Iolaus who thought beyond the immediate problem to the system that created it. Fire to cauterize the wounds, to prevent regrowth, to stop the multiplication at its source. But even this solution was incomplete, imperfect. The immortal head couldn't be destroyed, could only be buried, hidden, contained under a massive rock that Heracles placed over it, a rock that still shifts sometimes, that still shows cracks where poison seeps through, where the head continues to live, to wait, to plan its eventual return. The Hydra's blood, spilled during the battle, became another form of poison, another legacy of toxicity. Heracles dipped his arrows in it, creating weapons that would kill with a scratch, that would make every future victory tainted with the Hydra's corruption. The blood seeped into the swamp, making it even more poisonous, creating new forms of deadly life, new variations on the theme of multiplication and doom that defines this place. Even dead, if the Hydra can truly die, its influence continues. The swamp has absorbed so much of its essence that the distinction between creature and habitat has become meaningless. Is the swamp the Hydra's home, or is the Hydra the swamp's expression? Do the poisonous pools exist because the Hydra lives here, or does the Hydra live here because the poisonous pools called it into being? The questions multiply like heads, each answer spawning new questions, new uncertainties, new reasons to fear this place. The local people, those who live close enough to the swamp to know its dangers, but far enough to survive them, have developed their own relationship with this corrupted landscape. They leave offerings at its edges, not to appease the Hydra, but to maintain boundaries, to say this far and no farther, to negotiate with toxicity rather than trying to defeat it. They've learned that some problems can't be solved, only managed only contained, only lived with at a careful distance. They tell stories about the swamp that aren't in the official mythologies. Stories about people who've entered and returned, changed, not dead, but not entirely alive either. These people speak in whispers about what they've seen in the deeper pools, about heads that don't match the classical descriptions, about conversations with something that might be the Hydra, or might be the swamp itself, or might be something that predates both, something that uses the Hydra as its voice, its hands, its way of touching a world it can't otherwise reach. The swamp generates its own weather, its own microclimate of toxicity and decay. Clouds form over it that rain poison on the surrounding lands, expanding its influence drop by drop, year by year. The border between swamp and not swamp isn't fixed, but fluid, advancing and retreating according to patterns that might be seasonal or might be emotional, as if the swamp has moods, has desires, has plans that unfold over centuries rather than days. At night, the swamp glows with phosphorescent light, not healthy bioluminescence, but the glow of decay, of chemical reactions that shouldn't happen in nature. The light reveals things better left unseen, the true extent of the corruption, the creatures that only emerge in darkness, the way the trees seem to lean toward the center of the swamp, as if drawn by something, as if paying homage to something, as if they know where their loyalty lies. Sometimes, on the stillest nights, when even the reeds stop whispering, you can hear something from the deepest part of the swamp, a sound like breathing, but too big to be breathing, like a heartbeat, but too complex to be a single heart. It might be the Hydra in some form we don't understand, some life process that goes beyond what we think of as life. Or it might be the swamp itself, alive in ways that challenge our definitions, conscious in ways that make our consciousness seem simple, planning in timescales that make our lives seem like momentary flickers. The Hydra represents multiplication of problems, yes, but also something deeper. The idea that destruction and creation are not opposites, but aspects of the same force, that every ending spawns new beginnings, that every solution creates new problems. The swamp is this principle made landscape, made real, made unavoidable. It's the place where heroic solutions fail, where clever solutions only partially succeed, where the only real solution is acceptance that some things can't be solved. We leave the swamp as everyone leaves it, if they leave it at all. Poisoned slightly, changed subtly, carrying some of its toxicity with us into the world beyond. The smell clings to clothes and hair and dreams, the images of those multiplying heads, of that impossible regeneration, of that immortal center that can't be killed. These stay with us, remind us that not every monster can be slain, not every problem can be solved, not every story has a clean ending. But our journey continues, must continue, away from the swamps and their multiplying dooms, up into the mountains, where the air is thin and clean, where fire burns without poison, where a different kind of impossibility makes its home. We climb toward the chimera's domain, toward a creature that shouldn't exist but does, toward a living contradiction that breathes fire into the night sky, toward another lesson in the monstrous creativity of ancient fears, high above the world of men, where the air grows thin and thoughts become strange from lack of oxygen, where the boundary between earth and sky becomes uncertain. The mountain that houses the chimera rises like an accusation against the natural order, a geological impossibility that mirrors the biological impossibility it shelters. This is Mount Cragos in Lycia, though the ancient name carries meanings that modern tongues can't properly shape. Meanings that speak of fire without source, of stone that lives, of a peak that exists partially in this world and partially somewhere else. Somewhere where the rules that govern normal existence have been negotiated differently, have been written in a language of flame and hybrid flesh. The approach to this mountain requires days of climbing through landscapes that shift from Mediterranean scrubland to something else, something that has no name, because naming would require understanding, and understanding would require acceptance that such places can exist. The olive trees give way to pines, but these pines have been changed. Their needles sharp as metal, their sap running red like blood, their roots digging deep into soil that glows faintly at night with heat from below, from within, from sources that geology cannot explain. The animals here, the few that remain, have adapted to the chimera's presence in ways that speak of generations of exposure to impossibility, developing third eyes to watch the sky, growing armor where fur should be, learning to move in patterns that make no sense unless you understand. They're avoiding not just the creature, but the places where its breath has changed the very nature of space. The mountain itself is wrong in ways that become more apparent the closer you approach. The more you study its impossible angles, its surfaces that seem to shift when you're not looking directly at them. The stone here is not entirely stone, or rather, it's stone that has been transformed by repeated exposure to the chimera's fire, crystallized into something between rock and glass, between solid and liquid, holding heat from flames that burned centuries ago, releasing it slowly like memories of combustion. When you touch these transformed stones, if you're foolish enough to touch them, they sing, actually sing, in frequencies that resonate with bones, with teeth, with the calcium in your body responding to some ancient harmony of mineral and flame. There are caves all through the mountain, not natural caves, but spaces that have been burned into existence, tunnels carved by fire that shouldn't be able to carve, chambers hollowed out by breath that does more than burn, that transforms, that makes space where space shouldn't be. These caves connect in patterns that follow no logical structure, that seem to exist in more than 3 dimensions, passages that you can walk through in one direction for hours and emerge from the same entrance you entered, but changed, subtly changed, as if the journey through the impossible space has altered you in ways you won't fully understand for years. The vegetation at different altitudes tells the story of the chimera's presence like tree rings tell the story of years. At the lowest levels, where its influence is weakest, plants grow almost normally, just tougher, more defensive, as if preparing for war. Higher up, they become increasingly strange, developing features that shouldn't exist on plants. Eyes that track movement, mouths that open and close with no purpose anyone can determine. Root systems that spell out words in dead languages when excavated. At the highest levels, near the chimera's primary lair, vegetation gives up entirely on normal forms, becoming something between plant and mineral, between life and unlife. Crystalline structures that photosynthesize impossible light from stars that might not exist in our sky. The bones are everywhere once you reach a certain altitude, but they're not normal bones, not anymore. The chimera's fire doesn't just burn flesh from bone, It changes the bones themselves, converts them into something that preserves not just the shape, but the terror, the final moment, the last thought before flame took everything. These bones, when the wind moves through them, which is often because the wind here never really stops, produce sounds that might be music or might be screaming or might be both simultaneously. Some of the bones are from creatures that match no known anatomy, suggesting either that the chimera's victims come from elsewhere or that its fire can transform even in death, creating new impossibilities from old realities. The air at this altitude should be thin, cold, difficult to breathe. And it is all of these things, but also more, also worse. It tastes of metal and sulfur and something sweet like flowers that bloom in no earthly garden. It carries particles that glitter in sunlight, that might be ash or might be scales, or might be something that has no name because it shouldn't exist. Breathing this air changes you, slowly, subtly, making you more capable of surviving in the chimera's domain, but less capable of surviving anywhere else, as if the mountain is claiming you, converting you, making you part of its impossible ecosystem. The chimera itself, when you finally see it, if you're unfortunate enough to see it, defies the simple description of lion, goat, and serpent that mythology provides. Yes, there is something leonine about the front portion, but it's a lion that has never been just a lion dreamed by something that has only heard descriptions of lions, has never seen one, has had to imagine what lion means, and has imagined something more terrible than any natural lion could be. The mane is not hair, but something between hair and flame, constantly moving, constantly burning, but never consumed, generating light that casts shadows that fall in directions shadows shouldn't fall. The goat portion, rising from the back, is even more wrong because it exists in the wrong place, violating the basic symmetry that even monsters usually respect. It's not just a goat head, but an entire goat's front body emerging from the lion's spine, complete with legs that paw at air, that sometimes find purchase on nothing, walking on invisible surfaces that might exist in dimensions we can't perceive. The goat's eyes are horizontal pupilled like normal goats, but they see too much, track things that aren't there, or perhaps track things that are there, but that human eyes can't detect. Movements in the spaces between spaces. The serpent tail is perhaps the most disturbing element because it's clearly conscious, clearly independent, clearly has its own agenda that sometimes aligns with the rest of the creature and sometimes doesn't. It speaks. This serpent tail, not in words, but in patterns of hissing that suggest language, that sometimes seem to be arguing with the lion head, disagreeing with the goat head, proposing alternatives that the composite creature must somehow reconcile. The serpent's scales reflect not light, but heat, showing thermal patterns that reveal the invisible, the hidden, the things that warm-blooded creatures would prefer, remain unseen. But describing the parts doesn't capture the whole, doesn't convey the fundamental wrongness of the chimera, the way it violates not just biology, but philosophy, the way it challenges the very concept of identity, of unity, of what it means to be a single creature. It moves with three different gaits simultaneously: the lion stalking, the goat prancing, the serpent slithering, yet somehow these contradictory movements combine into locomotion that covers ground with impossible efficiency. It hunts with three different strategies, thinks with three different minds, exists in three different relationships with reality, yet functions as one impossible whole. The fire it breathes is not normal fire, could never be normal fire. It burns without fuel, spreads without heat, consumes without destroying, or rather, destroys by transforming, rather than by simple combustion. Things burned by the chimera's fire don't become ash, they become other, changed at a fundamental level into materials that shouldn't exist, that violate conservation of mass and energy, that suggest the fire comes from somewhere else, some other universe where physics works differently, where impossibility is possible. The mountain peak where the chimera makes its primary lair has been transformed by centuries of this impossible fire into something that exists partially outside normal space. The stone here has become translucent in places, and through it you can see not the mountain's interior, but somewhere else, some other place that might be another world or might be the inside of the chimera's consciousness made visible, made geographical. The boundary between inside and outside has become negotiable here, permeable, uncertain. Time moves differently at the peak, not faster or slower, but sideways, recursive, folded back on itself. You can sometimes see echoes of events that haven't happened yet, shadows of creatures that died centuries ago still fleeing from flames that no longer burn. The chimera itself exists in all these times simultaneously, hunting in the past, feeding in the present, dying in futures that may or may not come to pass. This temporal confusion might explain how it can be three things at once, might suggest that it's not truly hybrid, but rather three separate creatures existing in the same space at different moments, their timelines intersecting in ways that create the illusion of combination. The chimera sleeps, but its sleep is not like the sleep of normal creatures. Each part sleeps separately, in cycles that overlap but never completely align, meaning the creature is never fully asleep, never fully awake, always existing in some state between consciousness and unconsciousness. During these partial sleeps, it dreams, and its dreams become temporarily real, manifesting as smaller chimeras, combination creatures that exist for minutes or hours before dissolving back into impossibility. These dream chimeras hunt, feed, burn, leaving evidence of their temporary existence in scorched earth and traumatized wildlife that remembers being hunted by things that no longer exist. The local people of ancient Lycia knew better than to climb the mountain, knew better than to even look too long at its peak, where strange lights danced at night, where clouds formed in patterns that hurt to perceive. They told stories not of heroes who slayed the chimera, but of wise men who avoided it, who found other routes, other solutions, other ways to live with impossibility as a neighbor. They developed a mythology not of conquest, but of coexistence, of boundaries respected, of certain places that belong to monsters and must remain theirs. But Bellerophon came, as heroes always come, riding Pegasus, that other impossible creature born from Medusa's death, as if impossibility breeds impossibility, as if monsters create the very things that will destroy them. He came with a spear tipped with lead, understanding something about the chimera's fire that others had missed, that it could be turned against itself, that the impossible heat could melt the lead, could choke the very throat that produced it. He attacked from above, from the air, fighting impossibility with impossibility, riding a flying horse to battle a breathing contradiction. The battle, if the stories are true, if any stories about impossible things can be true, lasted for days or minutes or years, depending on how time was flowing on the mountain during the conflict. Bellerophon and Pegasus wove through the air in patterns that matched the chimera's triple nature, attacking from 3 angles simultaneously, or perhaps sequentially. Or perhaps the difference doesn't matter when time itself has become uncertain. The chimera's fire met Pegasus's wings, impossibility clashing with impossibility, creating explosions of reality violation that left scars on the mountain that still refused to heal. The lead spear, when it finally found its mark, didn't kill the chimera so much as resolve it, collapse its contradictions into something singular, something that could die because it was no longer trying to be 3 things at once. The death of the chimera was also a birth or an unbirth, as the 3 creatures that had been forced into one, separated in death, became distinct, became possible just long enough to cease. The lion died like a lion, the goat like a goat, the serpent like a serpent, and in their separation, in their return to singularity, the impossibility that was the chimera ceased to be. But the mountain remembers. The caves still exist in too many dimensions. The stones still sing their mineral songs. The fire still burns in places, sourceless, consuming nothing, producing light that casts shadows in directions that shouldn't exist. The chimera is dead, but its impossibility has seeped into the mountain itself, making it a monument to contradiction, to the violent creativity of a universe that sometimes makes mistakes, sometimes creates things that shouldn't be, sometimes allows impossibilities to walk and breathe and burn. The deeper caves, the ones that even the chimera avoided, go down into the mountain's heart, where the stone becomes increasingly theoretical, increasingly uncertain about its own existence. Here, in chambers that might be vast or might be tiny, depending on how you approach them, other impossible things have gathered, drawn by the resonance of contradiction, by the comfort of being among other things that shouldn't exist. These things don't have names because naming would require understanding their nature, and their nature is to have no nature, to exist in the spaces between categories, between possibilities, between the real and the unreal. Some theoretical philosophers, those who think about monsters as concepts rather than creatures, suggest that the chimera was never really about the physical combination of lion, goat, and serpent, but about the philosophical challenge of composite identity. Can something be multiple things simultaneously? Can contradictions coexist without resolution? Can impossibility become possible simply through insistence, through existence, through the sheer audacity of being? The chimera, living or dead, real or mythological, answers yes to all these questions. But its yes comes wreathed in fire, written in burns on stone, spoken in languages that have 3 different grammars operating simultaneously. The mountain has become a pilgrimage site for those who seek impossibility, who want to touch contradiction, who need to know that the rules can be broken, that nature can be violated, that sometimes things that shouldn't exist do exist anyway. They climb through the transformed landscapes, breathe the impossible air, touch the singing stones, and some of them claim to see the chimera still, not alive, but not exactly dead either, existing in the corner of vision, in the moment between sleep and waking, in the place where 3 thoughts try to become one and create something that thought was never meant to produce. As we descend from these impossible heights, leaving behind the mountain that exists in too many dimensions, the air that tastes of contradiction, the stones that remember impossible fire. We carry with us the knowledge that some monsters are not just physically impossible, but philosophically challenging, that they exist not just to be slain, but to make us question what existence means, what identity means, what the boundaries are between one thing and another. The chimera is dead, if it ever lived, but the questions it poses remain as alive as its fire, as multiple as its nature, as impossible as its existence. Our path leads us now deeper still, away from the bright impossibility of the chimera's mountain toward darker impossibilities, toward caves that go not just into the earth but through it, toward the source from which so many monsters spring, toward the mother of monsters herself, toward Echidna in her endless caves where creation and procreation have become the same thing, where birth is always monstrous and monstrosity is always fertile, deep beneath the world that knows sunlight, deeper than roots reach, deeper than water flows, deeper than the dead are buried. There exists a system of caves that may not be caves at all, but rather the body of something vast, something that has been sleeping so long it has become geology, or perhaps geology that has been dreaming so long it has become alive. These are the dwelling places of Echidna, she who is called the mother of monsters, though mother implies a simplicity of relationship that doesn't capture what she is to her children, what her children are to the world, what the world has become because of her fertile impossibility. The entrance to her realm, if entrance is the right word for something that might be an orifice rather than an opening, can be found in many places or no places, depending on whether she wants to be found, whether she's hungry for company or sated with solitude. The descent begins gradually, so gradually you might not realize you're going underground rather than simply entering a shadowed valley, a narrow canyon, a place where the walls grow closer and the sky grows smaller until there is no sky, only stone above, around, embracing with a pressure that is almost affectionate, almost maternal, almost like being swallowed by something that loves you. The stone here is warm, body temperature warm, and it pulses with a rhythm that might be your heartbeat, or might be something else's heartbeat, something whose heart is the size of a cathedral, whose blood is the underground rivers, whose breath is the wind that moves through these passages, carrying scents of minerals and monsters. The caves don't follow geological logic, don't respect the rules that govern normal stone, normal spaces carved by water and time. They spiral like the inside of a shell, but a shell that exists in more than 3 dimensions, passages that curve back on themselves without ever intersecting, chambers that are simultaneously vast and intimate, distances that change depending on who is walking them and why. The walls are smooth in places, ridged in others, textured like skin or scales or something between the two, something that suggests these caves were not carved but grown, not excavated but excreted, not found but birthed. Echidna herself, when you finally reach the chambers deep enough to contain her, is revelation and revulsion in equal measure. Beauty and horror so intertwined they become indistinguishable, become the same thing viewed from different angles, or perhaps the same angle viewed with different eyes. From the waist up, she is a woman of such beauty that beauty becomes terrible, becomes weapon, becomes the thing that makes you understand why gods and mortals alike would mate with her despite what she is below the waist. Her face carries the kind of perfection that speaks of divinity, of purposeful creation, of someone deciding what beauty should be, and making it manifest without concern for whether mortals could survive viewing it. But from the waist down, she is serpent, not simple serpent, but serpent perfected, serpent magnified, serpent made archetypal. The scales shift color with each movement, showing hues that don't exist in normal light, that require the special darkness of these deep places to be visible. The serpent portion of her body extends far beyond what the human portion would suggest, coiling through chambers, through passages, perhaps through the entire cave system, making it impossible to say where Echidna ends and her dwelling begins, whether the caves are where she lives or whether she is the caves, living. She doesn't age, doesn't change, doesn't experience time the way mortal things do. She exists in a perpetual state of potential motherhood, always pregnant with possibilities, always ready to birth new impossibilities into a world that doesn't want them, but can't exist without them. Her womb, if she has a womb, if womb is the right word for the space within her where monsters gestate, operates according to its own logic, its own timeline, sometimes producing offspring in days, sometimes taking centuries to craft a single perfect abomination. The children she has already birthed read like a catalogue of nightmare, a genealogy of terror that spans the entire Greek mythological landscape. The chimera was hers, that impossible combination we just left burning on its mountain. The Hydra was hers, multiplying its heads in poisonous swamps. Cerberus was hers, the three-headed dog who guards the underworld's gates. The Sphinx was hers, asking riddles that kill. The Nemean lion was hers, with its impenetrable hide. Scylla might be hers, though the genealogies conflict, twist, contradict themselves like her children's anatomies. But these famous monsters are only the beginning, the ones that made it into stories, the ones that encountered heroes and thus entered history. For every monster that appears in mythology, Echidna has birthed 100 that don't. Creatures too terrible for stories, too impossible for language. Things that exist in the deep places and have never seen sun, never met human, never needed to, because their purpose is not to challenge heroes, but to exist as pure potential for monstrosity, as proof that creation has no limits, no boundaries, no point at which it says, this is too much, this goes too far. The caves around her are nurseries, each chamber designed for a different kind of gestation, a different form of impossible birth. Some are filled with eggs that pulse with their own light, containing things that are not ready to hatch, may never be ready, may be waiting for conditions that will never exist. Others hold cocoons of substances that aren't silk, aren't any material that has a name, wrapped around shapes that suggest transformation rather than birth. Things that were one thing becoming another thing, or perhaps things that are perpetually between states, never settling on a final form. She tends these nurseries with a mother's care, if care can be applied to actions that involve feeding some offspring to others, to encouraging mutations through selective breeding with herself, to creating conditions of such extreme pressure, temperature, toxicity that only the most impossible things can survive. Her motherhood is not nurturing in any sense humans would recognize, but it is purposeful, deliberate, aimed at producing ever more perfect monsters, ever more impossible combinations, ever more fundamental violations of what should be. The father of many of her children is Typhon, imprisoned now beneath Mount Etna, but once free, once the storm that nearly overthrew the gods themselves. Their mating, when it occurred, was cataclysm made procreative, was destruction becoming creation, was the cosmic force of chaos finding its feminine expression and producing offspring that embody different aspects of impossibility. Each child represents a different way the universe can go wrong, a different failure of natural law, a different proof that the rules are more like suggestions, that order is more fragile than we pretend. But Echidna doesn't need Typhon to procreate, doesn't need any father for her monstrous children. She can birth parthenogenetically, creating from herself alone, splitting off pieces of her impossibility and nurturing them into independent impossibilities. Sometimes she mates with her own children, creating recursive monsters, things that are their own grandparents, their own descendants, their own mythological paradoxes. The genealogies become impossible to track, become circles, become spirals, become patterns that hurt to contemplate because they violate causality itself. In the deepest chambers, the ones even she rarely visits, there are things that might be her parents, or might be her children, or might be versions of herself from different times, different possibilities, different ways the universe might have gone wrong. These things don't have forms that can be described, because description requires consistency, and they have none, existing in states of constant flux, constant becoming, never being long enough to be named or known or understood. They might be conscious or might be something beyond consciousness, might be alive or might be something that makes the distinction between life and non-life irrelevant. The air in these deep chambers is thick with potential, with the possibility of monsters not yet born, not yet conceived, not yet even imagined. It tastes of metal and milk, of blood and honey, of all the fluids involved in birth and death, mixed into something that is neither, that is both, that is the medium in which impossibility becomes possible. Breathing this air changes you at levels below consciousness, below cell, below atom, makes you slightly more capable of producing or becoming monstrosity yourself. She speaks, Echidna, though speech isn't quite right for the sounds she makes, the communications she offers. Her voice comes from everywhere in the caves at once, or perhaps the caves are her voice. The echo chambers of her throat, made geographical. She speaks in languages that predate human speech, that predate speech itself, using sounds that convey meaning directly to the parts of the brain that existed before reason, before language, before humans pretended they were separate from monsters. What she says, if it can be translated, if translation is possible for communications that bypass language entirely, concerns the necessity of monsters, the ecological role of the impossible, the reason why a universe that could be orderly chooses to produce chaos. Monsters, she suggests without words, are not mistakes, but features, not violations, but variations, not enemies of order, but the things that define order by existing outside it. Without monsters, heroes have no purpose. Without chaos, order has no meaning. Without impossibility, possibility becomes prison. She remembers the time before heroes, when monsters walked freely, when humans understood their place in a world that included things beyond human understanding. She remembers and perhaps misses it. Or perhaps she's patient, knowing that heroes are temporary, but monsters are eternal. that every hero who slays a monster becomes, in some sense, a monster themselves, that the distinction between hero and monster is more fluid than either side wants to admit. The caves extend beyond her, deeper than even she goes, connecting perhaps to other cave systems, other underworlds, other places where the surface world's rules don't apply. Sometimes things come up from these deeper places, things that even Echidna regards with something like respect or fear or recognition of a monstrosity greater than her own. These things don't stay, don't interact, just pass through on their way to somewhere else, leaving behind only the sense that there are depths below depths, darknesses below darkness, impossibilities that make even the mother of monsters seem almost natural by comparison. Those who have seen Echidna and survived, and there are some, though their accounts are considered madness, say that she is lonely, that her motherhood is driven not just by cosmic purpose, but by the simple desire for company, for beings that can exist in her presence without fleeing, fighting, or dying. Her monsters are her children, but also her companions, the only things that can understand what it's like to be impossible, to exist in violation of what should be, to be necessary but unwanted, to be fertile with horrors that the world needs but won't acknowledge needing. She offers sometimes to those who find her caves, who survive the descent, who stand before her without immediately going mad, a choice. Become one of her children, not through birth, but through transformation, through accepting monstrosity as improvement rather than degradation. Some accept disappearing into the caves, emerging later, if at all, as things that were once human, but are now something else, something more, something that understands the world from the perspective of the monster rather than the hero. The caves are not static but growing, extending, reaching out through the earth like roots, like veins, like the expanding nervous system of something vast and patient. Every year they grow a little closer to the surface, a little more present in the world above. Sometimes they break through in unexpected places, creating sinkholes that are really birth canals, openings through which new monsters can emerge, through which Echidna's influence can seep into the surface world. She is served, if served is the right word, by things that might once have been human or might be prototypes for humanity, experiments in consciousness that preceded or will succeed our current form. These servants maintain the caves, tend the eggs and cocoons, feed the things that need feeding with substances better not examined too closely. They don't speak, possibly can't speak, but they understand, they remember, they perform their functions with a dedication that might be worship, or might be the simple recognition that in Echidna's presence, in the caves of the mother of monsters, they have found the only place where what they've become makes sense. As we prepare to leave these deepest caves, ascending through passages that seem eager to expel us, to return us to a world where impossibility is the exception rather than the rule, we carry with us the knowledge that beneath everything, beneath civilization, beneath the earth itself, creation continues in forms we don't want to acknowledge. Echidna remains, will always remain, the fertile darkness from which new horrors emerge, the womb of impossibility that ensures the world will never run out of monsters, will never be safe, will never be fully known or understood or tamed. But one last descent awaits us, one final depth to explore, though this one is not a cave but a prison, not a womb but a tomb that refuses to hold its occupant, Not a mother, but a father, the father of monsters, Typhon himself, buried beneath Etna, but not dead, never dead, raging still against his imprisonment, his fury making the mountain shake, his breath making it burn, his existence a reminder that some monsters are too powerful to kill, can only be contained, and that containment is always temporary, as it was in the beginning, before Zeus claimed his throne, before the Olympians imposed their order on chaos. There was Typhon, and in some sense there still is Typhon, will always be Typhon. For beings of such primordial power don't truly die, don't truly end. They only transition from active threat to contained potential, from present danger to future inevitability. Mount Etna rises from the Sicilian landscape like a monument to divine fear. To the extremes even gods must reach when facing something that threatens not just their rule, but existence itself. And beneath its volcanic mass, in spaces that are less prison than battlefield, frozen in time, Typhon waits with the patience of geological ages, with the fury of fundamental forces, with the certainty that entropy always wins, that chaos always returns, that prisons are temporary, but prisoners like him are eternal. The mountain itself is symptom and symbol, evidence and warning, a volcanic peak that burns not with normal geological fire, but with the rage of something that should never have been imprisoned, could never be permanently imprisoned, something whose very existence is argument against the possibility of permanent order. The locals have lived with Etna's moods for millennia, have learned to read its tremors like a language, though it's not the mountain speaking, but the thing beneath. The thing that is larger than the mountain, older than the mountain, more fundamental than mere geology could ever be. Typhon, when he walked free, when he stormed across the cosmos, challenging Zeus's newfound authority, was description-defying, was language-breaking, was the kind of vast that makes vastness itself seem insufficient as a concept. His head, the stories say, brushed the stars, but this is simplification, reduction of something that existed in more dimensions than height, whose head might have been among stars or might have been stars, whose thoughts might have been constellations, whose dreams might have been galaxies being born and dying. His body was storm-made flesh, or flesh-made storm, or the place where the distinction between weather and creature ceased to matter. 100 dragon heads grew from his shoulders, each one speaking in different voices, different languages, different levels of reality. Some spoke in words, some in pure sound, some in alterations to local physics, some in probability shifts that made unlikely things certain and certain things impossible. When all 100 heads spoke at once, reality itself became uncertain, became negotiable, became something that had to be constantly maintained against Typhon's argument that it shouldn't exist, or should exist differently, or should exist in multiple contradictory ways simultaneously. His lower body was serpentine, but not single serpent, rather thousands of serpents, millions of serpents, a fractal pattern of serpents, where each scale was itself a serpent, and each of those serpents had scales that were serpents, recursion of reptilian form that went down to levels smaller than atoms, up to levels larger than mountains. When he moved, it wasn't movement as we understand it, but rather reality rearranging itself to accommodate his presence. Space bending, time stuttering, causality temporarily suspended while the universe figured out how to process something that violated its most basic assumptions. The battle between Typhon and Zeus was not just physical combat, but ontological warfare, a fight over what kind of universe would exist, whether order or chaos would define reality's basic nature. Zeus threw thunderbolts, but Typhon threw mountains. Zeus commanded storms, but Typhon was storm. Zeus represented divine order, but Typhon represented the older truth that order is always imposed on chaos, never fundamental, always fragile, always one strong challenge away from collapse. The battle ranged across the cosmos, through dimensions that don't have names, in spaces that existed only for the duration of their conflict and ceased when it ended. They fought with weapons that were concepts, with armor that was mathematics, with strategies that involved retroactively changing the past to affect the present. At one point, the myths tell us Typhon actually won, tore out Zeus's sinews, left him helpless, and for that brief period, chaos ruled, reality became fluid. Monsters walked freely, and gods hid in animal forms, pretending to be less than they were to avoid Typhon's attention. But Zeus recovered, through trickery, through help, through the kind of narrative inevitability that says order must triumph over chaos in stories, even if not in reality. The final battle took place here, in Sicily, where Zeus trapped Typhon, used the weight of Mount Etna itself as a prison, as a seal, as a stone rolled over a tomb that could never quite contain what it was meant to contain. But imprisonment is not death, and for beings like Typhon, might not even be imprisonment, might just be a different form of existence, a different angle of attack on a reality he still rejects. Beneath Etna, in spaces that exist outside normal geography, Typhon continues. His 100 heads still speak, their words becoming lava, their breath becoming volcanic gas, their thoughts becoming earthquakes. His serpentine lower body has burrowed into the earth, perhaps through the earth, perhaps creating the network of volcanic activity that circles the globe, perhaps connecting all volcanoes into a single system that is really just Typhon's circulatory system, his way of remaining present in a world that thinks it has imprisoned him. The prison itself is fascinating in its impossibility, in its necessity, in its fundamental failure to be what it pretends to be. It's not walls that hold Typhon, but weight, not chains, but gravity itself weaponized, not locks, but the mass of earth and divine will combined into something that almost contains something uncontainable. The space Typhon occupies beneath Etna is larger than the mountain above, larger than Sicily, larger than physics should allow, a pocket dimension of punishment where size and space follow different rules, where a mountain can contain something larger than worlds. He is not alone down there, though alone might not be the right concept for something with 100 heads that might each be separate consciousnesses, might be a parliament of personalities voting on when to rage, when to rest, when to test the prison's boundaries. Things have been drawn to his presence over the millennia, things that feed on divine anger, on cosmic frustration, on the radiation of raw chaos that leaks from him like heat from a reactor. These things have evolved in his presence, become adapted to impossibility, become their own ecosystems of chaos-touched life that shouldn't exist, but does. The volcanic chambers around Typhon's prison are not empty but full of substances that are neither magma nor stone, but something between, something that remembers being part of Typhon, remembers being flesh or scale or breath before Zeus's power transformed it into geological feature. These substances move with purpose that might be Typhon's will, or might be their own inherited consciousness, creating patterns in the volcanic activity that spell out messages in languages only gods can read, threats and promises and reminders that imprisonment is temporary, but rage is eternal. Sometimes when Etna erupts with particular violence, it's not random geological event, but Typhon testing his bonds, pushing against his prison, measuring how much divine will has weakened over the centuries, how much Zeus's attention has wandered to other concerns. Each eruption is experiment and attack, probe and protest, reminder and warning. The lava that flows during these eruptions carries more than heat, carries fragments of Typhon's essence into the world, seeds of chaos that take root in unexpected places, grow into new impossibilities, new challenges to order. The local people have developed complex relationships with the mountain, with the prison, with the prisoner. They leave offerings not to placate Typhon, but to strengthen his prison, gifts to Zeus and the other Olympians to remember, to maintain vigilance, to keep the seals strong. They tell stories about the mountain that aren't in the official mythologies, stories about times when Typhon's influence leaked out in ways other than eruption, when his dreams became temporarily real, when his 100 heads sang in harmony and reality forgot its own rules for dangerous moments. In the deepest part of night, when the mountain glows with internal fire, you can sometimes hear them, the 100 dragon heads, each speaking its own truth, its own version of how reality should be, its own argument against the current order. Some speak of ages before the gods, when chaos was pure and purposeless and perfect. Others speak of futures where entropy wins, where all order dissolves, where Typhon breaks free and unmakes Zeus's creation. Still others speak of present moments in parallel dimensions, where the battle went differently, where Typhon won, where reality follows different rules, where chaos is the default and order the aberration. The prison affects time strangely, as prisons of divine beings often do. Past, present, and future become uncertain near Etna, become negotiable, become fluid. Sometimes effects precede causes. Sometimes events happen that then unhappen. Sometimes the same moment repeats with slight variations, as if reality is stuttering, uncertain how to proceed in the presence of something that shouldn't exist but does. Those who spend too long near the mountain report temporal displacement, remembering things that haven't happened yet, forgetting things that just occurred, existing in multiple moments simultaneously. Typhon's rage has physical effects beyond the volcanic, beyond the geological. It influences weather patterns across the Mediterranean, creates storms that shouldn't exist according to meteorology, generates winds that blow in impossible directions. It affects probability, making unlikely things more likely near the mountain, making the impossible possible, making reality itself less certain, less stable, less reliable. It even affects consciousness, giving those near the mountain dreams that might be Typhon's thoughts leaking out, might be glimpses of the chaos that waits beneath all order. The relationship between Typhon and Echidna, his mate, the mother of monsters, adds another dimension to his imprisonment. Are they still in communication through the deep passages that connect all underground spaces? Do their children visit him, report to him, carry messages between their parents? Is his imprisonment also hers in some sense, limiting her ability to produce new monsters? Or does his contained rage actually fuel her fertility, give her the energy to birth ever more impossible things? The mythologies are unclear, perhaps deliberately so, perhaps because the truth is too complex for human understanding. Zeus visits sometimes, the locals say, though not in person, not in full divine presence, but in aspects, in avatars, in fragments of attention. He comes to check the seals, to reinforce the prison, to remind himself why Typhon must never be released. These visits correspond with unusual atmospheric phenomena, with lightning that strikes upward from the mountain's peak, with thunder that sounds like words in languages only gods speak. After these visits, the mountain is quiet for a time, Typhon subdued, or perhaps simply thinking, planning, waiting for the next opportunity. The prison is prophecy as much as punishment, containing not just Typhon's present, but his future. The inevitable moment when the seals will weaken, when Zeus's attention will wander too far, when chaos will return. Some prophecies say this will happen at the end of the current age, when the gods themselves fade, when their power becomes insufficient to maintain the prison. Others say it has already happened in some sense, that Typhon is already free in futures that haven't reached us yet, that his imprisonment is temporary illusion maintained by divine will and mortal belief. As it was in the beginning, so it shall be in the end, the old texts say, and Typhon is both beginning and end, the chaos from which order emerged and to which it will return. His prison beneath Etna is pause, not conclusion, comma, not period, a temporary suspension of the conflict between order and chaos that defines existence itself. The mountain burns with his rage, shakes with his struggles, exists as monument to the price of order, the cost of imposing structure on a universe that tends toward entropy. We leave Etna as everyone leaves it, whether tourist or local, whether believer or skeptic, carrying a faint tremor in our bones, a subtle uncertainty in our cells, a knowledge that beneath the surface of ordered reality lies something vast and patient and angry, something that will outlast the gods who imprisoned it, outlast the mountain that contains it, outlast everything except the chaos from which it came and to which everything eventually returns. Now, as the night deepens toward its darkest hours, as consciousness itself begins to fray at the edges like fabric worn too thin, we must weave together these 7 dwellings, these 7 monsters, these 7 expressions of the impossible that define the boundaries of what can exist. They are not separate stories, but facets of a single crystal, not isolated horrors, but connected chambers in the vast architecture of fear that underlies all human consciousness, all mortal understanding of a universe that contains more than it should, more than we can bear to know. Return with me first to the labyrinth, but see it now, not as unique construction, but as echo of patterns that repeat throughout our journey. The labyrinth's passages that fold back upon themselves mirror the recursive nature of the Hydra's regeneration, each severed head creating new problems like each turn in the maze creating new confusion. The labyrinth exists in Echidna's caves, those tunnels that connect to everywhere and nowhere, that follow no mappable logic. It exists in the strait between Scylla and Charybdis, where every path leads to disaster, where navigation becomes negotiation with inevitable loss. Even Typhon beneath Etna is imprisoned in a kind of labyrinth, a maze of divine will and geological weight that contains him through complexity rather than simple strength. The Minotaur's dual nature, human and bull, man and monster, prefigures every hybrid horror we've encountered. He is prototype for the chimera's impossible combination, for Scylla's transformation from beauty to beast, for Echidna herself, woman above and serpent below. Even Medusa carries this duality, still human in form, but monstrous in function, still beautiful in her way, but deadly in her beauty. They are all caught between categories, existing in the spaces between what should be, proving that boundaries are more fragile than we pretend, that the line between human and monster is drawn in sand, easily erased, easily crossed. Consider how transformation weaves through every dwelling place we've visited. Medusa transformed from priestess to monster, Scylla from nymph to nightmare, the very stones around them transformed by their presence. The Hydra transforms damage into multiplication, defeat into victory. The chimera is transformation incarnate, three beings transformed into one impossible whole. Echidna transforms divinity into monstrosity through her fertile womb. Typhon transforms his rage into geological events, his imprisonment into volcanic activity. None of these monsters were born as they are now. All were made, changed, corrupted, or elevated, depending on your perspective, proving that monstrosity is not state, but process, not being, but becoming. The theme of imprisonment runs through each dwelling like a chain made of inevitability. The Minotaur imprisoned in his labyrinth, Medusa in her cursed temple, the Hydra in its poisonous swamp that no one else can inhabit. Scylla and Charybdis imprisoned in their strait, forced to guard a passage they can never leave. The chimera imprisoned in its own impossible biology, unable to be one thing or another. Echidna imprisoned by her own fertility, forever producing children she'll never be able to truly mother. And Typhon most obviously imprisoned. But his imprisonment is just the most literal expression of a bondage they all share. The bondage of being too monstrous for the normal world, but too necessary to be eliminated entirely. See how each monster represents a different form of excess, a different way that nature can go too far. The Minotaur is excess of shame, hidden away, fed on human sacrifice. The Hydra is excess of life, regenerating beyond reason, beyond control. Medusa is excess of punishment, cursed beyond proportion to any crime. Scylla and Charybdis are excess of hunger, consumption without satisfaction. The chimera is excess of combination, too many things in one space. Echidna is excess of creation, fertility without restraint. Typhon is excess of power, force that threatens the very structure of reality. Together, they map the boundaries of excess, showing us where too much becomes monstrous. Each dwelling place corrupts space itself, makes geography monstrous. The labyrinth makes space a weapon, a trap, a confusion. The strait makes space a choice between disasters. Medusa's temple makes space deadly to perceive. The Hydra's swamp makes space poisonous to inhabit. The chimera's mountain makes space impossible, existing in too many dimensions. Echidna's caves make space recursive, connecting to itself in impossible ways. Typhon's prison makes space larger inside than outside, containing the uncontainable. These are not just places where monsters live, but places that have become monstrous themselves, infected by impossibility, transformed by proximity, two things that shouldn't exist. Notice how each monster challenges a different aspect of heroism, requires a different form of courage or cleverness to defeat or survive. The Minotaur requires navigation, the ability to maintain direction when everything encourages confusion. Scylla and Charybdis require acceptance of loss, the wisdom to choose the lesser evil. Medusa requires indirect action, fighting without looking, conquering without confronting. The Hydra requires innovation, finding new solutions when old ones create new problems. The Chimera requires fighting impossibility with impossibility, meeting hybrid with hybrid. Echidna cannot be defeated at all, only avoided or accepted. Typhon cannot be killed, only contained, and that temporarily. Together they teach that heroism is not single quality but spectrum of responses to different forms of threat. The waters that appear in these stories, the wine-dark sea around the strait, the black pools of the swamp, the corrupted temple pools, the underground rivers in Echidna's caves, even the molten rock that is Typhon's blood, all these waters are connected in the mythology of transformation. Water as medium of change, as boundary between states, as the element that can take any shape, become anything, carry any curse or blessing. The monsters are all associated with water in some way, even the Chimera on its mountain touched by clouds, even the Minotaur in his dry labyrinth where water drips unseen in the darkness. Water is what makes transformation possible, what allows solid to become liquid, human to become monster, possible to become impossible. Each monster also represents a different relationship with time. The Minotaur exists in cyclical time, 7 years, 7 youths, 7 maidens, repetition without progress. Scylla and Charybdis exist in tidal time, regular destruction on schedule, predictable but unavoidable. Medusa exists in frozen time, petrification as temporal cessation, everything stopped at the moment of fatal perception. The Hydra exists in multiplicative time, where every moment creates more moments, every action more consequences. The Chimera exists in simultaneous time, 3 temporal experiences happening at once. Echidna exists in generational time, past and future meeting in the present moment of birth. Typhon exists in geological time, rage measured in millennia, imprisonment in eons. The sounds each monster makes form a symphony of horror, each note necessary to the whole composition. The Minotaurs bellowing in the labyrinth, lonely and fierce. Scylla's 6-headed howling and Charybdis's sucking roar, the hissing of Medusa's snake hair harmonizing with her human weeping. The Hydra's multiple heads creating discordant chorus as they regenerate. The Chimera's triple voice roar and bleat and hiss combined. Echidna's communication that transcends sound speaks directly to consciousness. Typhon's 100 dragon heads, each speaking different truths in different languages. Together, they create the sound of chaos itself, the anti-music that underlies ordered reality, the noise that creation makes when it goes wrong. But perhaps most importantly, see how each monster is necessary, how the world would be diminished without them, how they serve functions that heroes and gods cannot serve. They are the shadows that define light, the chaos that gives meaning to order, the impossible that makes the possible precious. Without the Minotaur, the labyrinth is just architecture. Without Scylla and Charybdis, the strait is just water. Without Medusa, transformation has no consequence. Without the Hydra, problems have simple solutions. Without the Chimera, combination has limits. Without Echidna, monsters don't reproduce, don't evolve, don't continue. Without Typhon, the gods have no real challenger, no reminder of their own fragility. They are ecosystem as much as individual creatures, each one creating conditions that allow others to exist. The Hydra's poison might feed Echidna's children. Medusa's petrified victims might navigate the labyrinth in stone form. The Chimera's impossible fire might light Typhon's volcanic prison. Scylla might be Echidna's daughter, making the strait a family business of destruction. They reference each other, need each other, complete each other in the vast tapestry of terror that makes Greek mythology more than just stories, makes it a complete cosmology of fear. As we weave these 7 dwellings together, see them not as separate locations, but as chambers in a single vast temple to impossibility, each one leading to the next through passages we might not perceive, but that exist nonetheless. You can travel from the labyrinth to the strait through underwater passages, from the strait to Medusa's temple following the coast, from the temple to the swamp through poisoned groundwater, from the swamp to the Chimera's mountain following the dying vegetation, from the mountain to Echidna's caves through volcanic tubes, from Echidna to Typhon through the deep connections that run beneath all geography, and from Typhon back to the labyrinth through the recursion of imprisonment, the eternal return of the contained. This is the map of monstrosity, the geography of the impossible, the atlas of everything we fear and therefore need. These 7 dwellings are not 7 separate stories, but 7 verses of the same song, 7 movements in the same symphony, 7 breaths of the same sleeping giant who dreams our nightmares for us, who holds our terrors so we don't have to, who exists in the spaces we cannot bear to explore ourselves. Now, as the longest part of night gives way to the first suggestion of dawn, though dawn itself is still hours away, still just a promise that darkness makes to itself about eventual light, we find ourselves returning from the depths we've explored, ascending through layers of story and dream towards something like waking, though the waking will be gentle, gradual, like smoke dissipating rather than fire extinguishing. The monsters we visited settle back into their dwellings, not defeated, never defeated, but simply returning to their eternal vigil, their necessary existence, their patient waiting for the next visitor, the next hero, the next dreamer who needs to understand that the world contains more than daylight reveals. Feel yourself rising through the layers of earth that cover Typhon, through the weight of divine will and geological mass, but rising slowly, so slowly that you might not be rising at all, might simply be becoming lighter while remaining in the same place. His 100 dragon heads grow quiet now, not silent, but subdued, their voices becoming the low rumble that people mistake for normal volcanic activity, their rage banking like coals that will never fully extinguish, but can sometimes seem like mere warmth rather than world-ending fire. The prison will hold for now, for this night, for this moment, though everyone knows, has always known, that temporary is the only kind of containment possible for forces that existed before containers, before containment, before the very concept of inside and outside. Through Echidna's caves we drift, but she's returning to her deeper chambers now, her serpentine length retracting into spaces that exist outside normal geometry, her beautiful face disappearing into shadows that are more than absence of light, that are presence of something else, something that light cannot touch, cannot reveal, can only acknowledge by failing to penetrate. Her children, born and unborn, settle into their various stages of existence and potential existence, the eggs pulsing more slowly, the cocoons growing still, the nurseries quieting to the subdued hum of gestation that will continue whether we observe it or not, whether we fear it or not, whether we remember it or not. The Chimera's mountain releases us from its impossible geometries, its spaces that exist in too many dimensions, and we find ourselves descending through air that gradually becomes more breathable, more normal, though normal will never feel quite the same. After breathing the atmosphere of impossibility, the fires that burn without source continue burning, will always burn, but they seem more distant now, more like strange stars than immediate threats, more like reminders than warnings. The threefold creature itself, if it still exists, if it ever existed, if existence is the right word for something that violates the basic premise of existence, settles into its lair to dream its triple dreams, each head perhaps dreaming of being singular, of being whole, of being possible. The Hydra's swamp releases its hold on us reluctantly, the poisonous waters trying to cling to keep something of us as payment for passage, as tax for trespass, as simple expression of the acquisitive nature of toxicity. But we're moving beyond its reach now, though its reach is long, though its influence seeps through groundwater, through root systems, through the very moisture in the air. The heads, however many there are at this moment, and the number is always changing, always wrong, lower into the black water, to rest, to regenerate, to prepare for the next challenger who will learn that some problems multiply when attacked, that some battles create more enemies than they defeat. Medusa's temple fades behind us, but slowly, so slowly, as if stone has weight beyond the physical, as if petrification can affect time and memory as well as flesh. She remains in her sanctuary, in her prison, in her cursed home, neither alive nor dead, but something between, something that exists in the space between states, between definitions, between the beauty she was and the horror she has become. The snakes that are her hair settle into slower rhythms, their hissing becoming almost like lullabies, almost like the songs she might have sung when she was fully human, when she could look at faces without destroying them, when mirrors showed her reflection instead of her doom. The strait between Scylla and Charybdis calms as much as it ever calms, which is to say, the violence becomes predictable rather than random. The destruction becomes scheduled rather than chaotic. Scylla's 6 heads weave their hypnotic patterns in the darkness, waiting for dawn to bring new ships, new victims, new proof that some passages exact a price that must be paid, that cannot be negotiated, that represents the fundamental unfairness of a universe where monsters guard necessities. Charybdis continues her eternal cycle of consumption and regurgitation, swallowing the sea and vomiting it back, creating whirlpools that are really just expressions of hunger that can never be satisfied, need that can never be met, appetite that has become geography. And the labyrinth, first of our dwellings, last to release us, unspools its passages like thread, like the thread Ariadne gave Theseus, like the thread of story we've been following through the night. The Minotaur, Asterion, the starred one, the prince who became monster, the monster who remained prince, paces his familiar passages with the weight of eternal solitude, eternal imprisonment, eternal existence as a reminder that shame can take physical form, can require architecture to contain it, can demand sacrifice to sustain it. The walls that seem to close in on us now seem to open, to release, to suggest that exit is possible, has always been possible. But only when you're ready to leave, only when you've learned what the labyrinth has to teach. What have these monsters taught us in our night journey through their dwellings? that the impossible exists, has always existed, will always exist, regardless of our comfort with impossibility. That every ordered system contains its own chaos, every structure its own dissolution, every rule its own exception. That monsters are not mistakes but necessities, not violations but variations, not enemies but teachers wearing terrifying masks to ensure we pay attention to the lesson. That transformation is constant, that boundaries are permeable, that the line between human and monster is drawn fresh each day and erased each night. They've taught us that problems multiply when attacked carelessly, like the Hydra's heads. That some choices offer no good options, only degrees of disaster, like the strait between Scylla and Charybdis. That beauty can become weapon, that victim can become victimizer. That curse can outlive both curser and cursed, like Medusa in her temple. That combination creates impossibility. That impossibility can still function. That function doesn't require logic, like the chimera on its mountain. That creation continues in the dark. That fertility doesn't always produce beauty. That mothers can birth nightmares and love them nonetheless, like Echidna in her caves. That rage can move mountains, literally. That prisons can become volcanoes. That some forces are too fundamental to destroy, like Typhon beneath Etna. But more than these individual lessons, they've taught us about the ecology of fear, the way terrors interconnect, support each other, create a complete system where every monster has its place, its purpose, its particular necessity. They are not random horrors scattered across the mythological landscape, but carefully positioned guardians of boundaries we need, but cannot cross. Cannot cross, but need to know exist. Need to know exist, but cannot fully understand. They mark the edges of human experience, the places where our consciousness fails, where our categories collapse, where our certainty dissolves into the kind of doubt that is actually wisdom wearing an uncomfortable mask. Consider how quiet the world would be without them, how simple, how boring, how catastrophically safe. Heroes would have nothing to prove themselves against, no challenges worth meeting, no stories worth telling. Gods would have no threats to justify their power, no chaos to organize against, no reminders of their own potential for monstrosity. Humans would have no external fears to distract from internal ones, no monsters outside to project the monsters within upon, no impossible creatures to make their own impossibilities seem manageable by comparison. The monsters are mediators between the human and divine, existing in the space between mortal limitation and immortal power, proving that the space exists, that it can be inhabited, that the boundaries between categories are not walls, but membranes, permeable, crossable, meant to be transgressed even as they're meant to be maintained. Every hero who fights a monster becomes a little monstrous. Every god who creates or condemns a monster reveals their own monstrous potential. Every human who tells stories of monsters admits to the monster within, the part that understands impossibility because we are ourselves impossible. Conscious matter in an unconscious universe, meaning making creatures in a cosmos that might be meaningless. As the night continues its slow transformation toward dawn, though dawn is still distant, still hypothetical, still more promise than presence, the monsters settle deeper into their dwellings, into their roles, into their eternal purpose, as the things that go bump in the night, that make the bumping meaningful, that ensure night itself remains more than just absence of day. They don't sleep. can't sleep because sleep implies peace, and monsters are the antithesis of peace, are the disturbance that defines peace by contrast, are the chaos that makes order precious. But you can sleep, should sleep, are perhaps already sleeping, have perhaps been sleeping all along while traveling through these stories, these dwellings, these necessary nightmares. The journey we've taken exists in that special space between waking and sleeping, where stories become real, where real becomes story, where the distinction ceases to matter because truth operates differently in the dark, follows different rules, permits different possibilities. The ancient Greeks understood something we've forgotten in our electric-lit world. The darkness is not absence but presence, not empty but full, not nothing but everything we can't see, won't see, shouldn't see, but need to know exists. Their monsters were ways of acknowledging this darkness, of giving it form and name and dwelling place, of making treaties with the impossible, agreements that said, you stay in your labyrinth, your strait, your temple, your swamp, your mountain, your caves, your prison, and we'll stay in our cities, our houses, our beds, and we'll meet only in stories, only in dreams, only in the controlled encounters of mythology where heroes sometimes win, but monsters always endure. The monsters endure because they are more than individual creatures, more than specific threats. They are principles, forces, fundamental aspects of a universe that includes more than we can understand, more than we should understand, more than we want to understand but need to know exists. The Minotaur is every family secret. Scylla and Charybdis are every impossible choice. Medusa is every victim who becomes threat. The Hydra is every problem that multiplies when attacked. The Chimera is every impossible combination that somehow functions. Echidna is every fertile darkness that produces what we don't want but can't prevent. Typhon is every rage that shakes the foundations of order. Together, they form a complete cosmology of fear, a systematic exploration of all the ways things can go wrong, can become monstrous, can violate the comfortable categories we use to organize our understanding of the world. They are not random monsters, but necessary monsters, each one filling a specific ecological niche in the landscape of terror, each one teaching a specific lesson about the nature of existence, each one marking a specific boundary between the possible and impossible. But boundaries, as we've learned tonight, are not walls, but membranes, not barriers, but bridges, not endings, but transitions. The boundary between human and monster is crossed every time we act monstrously. The boundary between possible and impossible is crossed every time we imagine something new. The boundary between order and chaos is crossed every time we create or destroy. The boundary between sleeping and waking is crossed every time we dream, and we are crossing it now, have been crossing it all night, will continue crossing it as the night deepens toward dawn. The monsters wave farewell from their dwellings, if farewell is the right word for something that is not goodbye but until next time, not dismissal but promise of return. The Minotaur bellows once more in his labyrinth, a sound that might be loneliness or might be patience. Scylla's heads howl their harmonized hunger, while Charybdis swallows and releases, maintaining the rhythm of destruction that defines the strait. Medusa weeps in her temple, tears that turn to stone before they can fall. The Hydra raises its many heads above the poisonous water, each one looking in a different direction, watching all approaches to its swamp. The chimera breathes fire into the night sky, a beacon of impossibility that can be seen for miles. Echidna retreats deeper into her caves, pregnant with new monsters we haven't imagined yet. Typhon rages beneath Etna, making the mountain shake with reminders of his presence. They will be here tomorrow, have been here since yesterday's yesterday, will be here until tomorrow's tomorrow. They exist in the eternal present of mythology, always threatening, always contained, always necessary. They are the dark that defines light, the chaos that defines order, the impossible that defines possible. Without them, we would have no boundaries to cross, no fears to face, no heroes to celebrate. Without them, we would have no stories worth telling, no dreams worth dreaming, no nightmares worth waking from. So thank them, these monsters, these dwellers in impossible places, these guardians of the boundaries between what is and what shouldn't be, but is anyway. Thank them for existing so we don't have to be monstrous ourselves, or at least not all the time. Thank them for living in their labyrinths and straits and temples and swamps and mountains and caves and prisons so we can live in our houses and pretend we're safe. Thank them for being the darkness that makes our small lights seem bright, the chaos that makes our small orders seem meaningful, the impossibility that makes our small possibilities seem precious. The night is deep now, as deep as it will get before beginning its slow retreat toward dawn. This is the hour when the veil between worlds is thinnest, when the monsters are most present but also most peaceful, when the dwellings we've explored exist most fully but also most gently. This is the hour of deepest sleep, of strangest dreams, of the kind of rest that goes beyond physical to something deeper, something that refreshes not just body, but soul, not just mind, but the part of us that exists before mind, the part that understands monsters because it remembers being monstrous, remembers the time before we pretended to be purely human. Let yourself sink into this deepest sleep, this final descent that is also ascent, this ending that is also beginning. The monsters will guard your sleep as they've always guarded sleep, standing at the boundaries of consciousness, preventing the truly terrible things from crossing over, the things that even monsters fear, the things that have no names, because naming would make them real, and their reality would unmake everything else. In this deepest hour, in this stillest moment, in this pause between one breath and the next, between one heartbeat and the next, between one thought and the next, the monsters sing their lullabies. Not beautiful songs, but necessary songs. Songs that acknowledge darkness without trying to light it, acknowledge fear without trying to eliminate it, acknowledge impossibility without trying to make it possible. These are the songs that have been singing beneath all our stories, all our dreams, all our nights since the first human looked into darkness and wondered what looked back. The labyrinth sings of passages that lead nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The straight sings of choices that offer no victory, only different defeats. The temple sings of beauty that became weapon, curse that became identity. The swamp sings of problems that multiply, solutions that create new problems. The mountain sings of impossibility that functions, contradiction that exists. The caves sing of fertility that produces monsters, creation that cannot be controlled. The prison sings of rage that moves mountains, force that cannot be destroyed, only contained. Together, They create a symphony of necessary darkness, necessary fear, necessary impossibility. It's not beautiful music by any conventional standard, but it's true music, honest music, the kind of music that exists in the spaces between notes, in the silence between sounds, in the pause between breathing in and breathing out. It's the music of existence itself, which includes more than we want it to include, permits more than we want it to permit, contains more than we can contain in our small human consciousness. But consciousness expands in sleep, includes more, permits more, contains more. In sleep, we become larger, less defined, more capable of understanding monsters because we become somewhat monstrous ourselves, released from the constraints of logic, physics, possibility. In sleep, we can walk the labyrinth without getting lost because we understand that lost is just another kind of found. We can navigate the strait because we accept that loss is inevitable. We can look at Medusa because we have no eyes to turn to stone. We can battle the Hydra because we understand multiplication. We can comprehend the Chimera because we become composite ourselves. We can visit Echidna because we understand fertility. We can feel Typhon's rage because we contain our own suppressed storms. The dawn will come, is coming, has always been coming. But not yet, not quite yet. There's still time in the darkness, still space in the night, still room in sleep for one more breath, one more heartbeat, one more moment of suspension between the world of monsters and the world of morning. The monsters are patient. They've waited this long. They can wait a little longer. They will always wait, always be there, always exist in their dwellings at the edges of what we're willing to know. When you wake, if you wake, when morning finally claims you back from the night's journey, you might not remember the details of where we've been, what we've seen, who we've met in these dwelling places of the impossible. But something will remain, some residue of understanding, some faint knowledge that the world includes more than daylight reveals, that maps have edges marked, "Here be monsters," for good reason, that the monsters are not threats, but guardians, not enemies, but teachers, not violations, but variations on the theme of existence that includes everything, even the impossible, especially the impossible. The stories will remain as they've remained for thousands of years, told and retold, transformed and retransformed, but always essentially the same. There are places where monsters dwell, and these places are necessary, and the monsters are necessary, and our fear of them is necessary, and our stories about them are necessary, and our journey to visit them in the safe darkness of sleep and story is necessary. We need our monsters. We need our labyrinths and straits and cursed temples and poisonous swamps and impossible mountains and fertile caves and raging prisons. We need to know they exist even if we never visit them, especially if we never visit them. So rest now in the knowledge that you've made the journey, faced the monsters, explored their dwellings, and survived, are surviving, will survive to wake into a morning that seems safer because you know where the dangers dwell, seems more ordered because you've touched chaos, seems more possible because you've encountered impossibility. The monsters have shown you their faces, their places, their purposes, and in doing so have shown you something about your own face, your own place, your own purpose in a universe that includes both order and chaos, both possible and impossible, both human and monster. The night releases you slowly, gently, like a mother releasing a child who has grown too large to hold, like echidna releasing one of her offspring into the world, like the labyrinth releasing Theseus after he's learned what he needed to learn. You rise through layers of sleep toward waking, but slowly, so slowly, carrying with you the depth of where you've been, the darkness you've explored, the monsters you've met who are no longer quite as monstrous now that you know them, now that you understand their necessity, their purpose, their place in the vast ecology of existence. The first suggestion of dawn touches the eastern sky, not light yet, but the promise of light, not day yet, but the memory of day returning, not waking yet, but the possibility of waking approaching like a ship navigating the strait, accepting that some darkness will be lost to reach the light, that some dreams will be forgotten to return to the waking world, that some monsters will return to their dwellings to wait for the next night, the next journey, the next dreamer who needs to understand that the world is larger, stranger, more terrible, and more wonderful than daylight alone can reveal. Listen, can you hear it? Beneath the approaching sounds of morning, beneath the birds that begin to stir, beneath the wind that begins to shift, beneath even your own breathing that begins to quicken toward waking, there is another sound, older and deeper. It's the sound of stone settling in the labyrinth, of water moving in the strait, of snakes hissing in the temple, of bubbles rising in the swamp, of fire crackling on the mountain, of birth happening in the caves, of rage rumbling beneath the volcano. It's the sound of monsters returning to patience, to waiting, to their eternal vigil at the boundaries of what we're willing to know. They'll be there tonight, tomorrow night, every night, waiting in their dwellings, patient as stone, inevitable as darkness, necessary as the fear that keeps us careful, that keeps us human, that keeps us aware that we are small, temporary creatures in a universe that contains forces we cannot fight, cannot defeat, can only acknowledge, respect, and occasionally, on nights like this, visit in the safe companionship of story, in the gentle guidance of a voice that knows the way through the labyrinth and back, across the strait and back, past all the monsters and back to the morning that waits with patient certainty for night to complete its work. The monsters wave farewell, or perhaps it's not farewell, but simply acknowledgement, recognition, the kind of nod that passes between old acquaintances who know they'll meet again, who have always met, who exist in relation to each other. You are the daylight to their darkness, the order to their chaos, the possible to their impossible. Without you, they have no one to terrify. Without them, you have nothing to transcend. You complete each other, human and monster, in the vast story that contains all stories, the night that contains all nights, the sleep that contains all dreams. And now, as the last of night's darkness gives way to the first of dawn's light, as the monsters settle into their dwellings for the day, as you rise from the depths of sleep toward the surface of waking, remember this: you have walked with monsters and survived, have touched impossibility and remained possible, have entered the darkness and found your way back to light. You carry their stories now, their truths, their necessary existence as part of the complete world that includes both what we love and what we fear, both what we understand and what we never will. The journey ends where it began, in the threshold between sleeping and waking, between story and silence, between the world of monsters and the world of morning. Cross that threshold when you're ready, carrying with you whatever you need from the night's journey, leaving behind whatever needs to stay in the darkness. The monsters will guard what you leave. Keep it safe. Return it to you the next time you visit. The next time you need to remember that the world is larger than daylight suggests, stranger than reason permits, more wonderful and terrible than we can hold in our waking minds. Sleep now, if sleep is still with you, or wake if waking calls you. But either way, know that you have completed a journey, visited all 7 dwellings, met all 7 monsters, learned all 7 lessons about the necessity of the impossible, the beauty of the terrible, the truth of the mythological. You have been to where monsters dwell and returned, changed perhaps, but not transformed, not unless you choose transformation, not unless you decide that knowing monsters is worth becoming slightly monstrous yourself. The night ends, the story ends, the journey ends. But the monsters remain, eternal, patient, necessary, waiting in their dwellings for the next visitor, the next story, the next night when someone needs to remember that the boundaries of the possible are patrolled by impossible things, that the edges of the map are marked with monsters not to keep us away, but to remind us that there are always edges, always boundaries, always places where the known world ends and something else, something more, something monstrous and magnificent begins. Rest now. Rest in the knowledge that you have been to those edges and returned. Rest in the understanding that monsters are not enemies but guardians. Rest in the certainty that tomorrow the sun will rise on a world that seems ordinary but contains, in its hidden places, in its deep dwellings, all the impossibility you could ever need to make life mysterious, terrifying, wonderful. The monsters sleep, if monsters sleep. You sleep or wake or exist in that space between where all the best stories live. And somewhere, in a labyrinth that might be mind or might be stone, a Minotaur paces, patient as darkness, certain as fear, necessary as the night itself. This is where our story ends, in silence, in stillness, in the pause between one breath and the next, where all stories end and all stories begin, where monsters dwell and humans dream, where the impossible becomes possible for just long enough to remember that the world contains more than we know, more than we can know, more than we should know, but exactly as much as we need. Sleep well, dream deep, and remember, the monsters are always there, always waiting, always necessary, always.